So, ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome Bishop Robbins.
A month and a day ago, the book was launched here in this hall, and Ed Campion, in launching it, spoke of the history of this very place where you're sitting and how fitting it was really that that would have been chosen as the site for the launch. The book's aroused a lot of comment. The sheer extent of it has surprised me too, and a lot of other people. It's brought out all kinds of responses. The most favourable is, I've received lots of letters, cards, emails, telephone calls, saying that somehow I spoke to what people were feeling and thinking themselves and giving it words. Other people, of course, it doesn't speak to at all. It's quite contrary to anything they believe. Well, yes, I realise that would happen too. People, though, have taken out very different things from the book. It covers a lot, and so it's only natural, I suppose, that one chapter will speak to something in one person, while a quite different chapter will speak to another. A lot of the comment has been about the sexual abuse aspect. Well, it's where the book starts. It's the basis of it. Though it does go on to a lot of other things. It's about confronting power and sex, but never forget the subtitle, Reclaiming the Spirit of Jesus. And that's ultimately what I hope the book's about. That's ultimately why I bring up these issues of abuse and start from them, because in everything, and most of all, first of all, deep within myself, I want somehow to renew the spirit of Jesus. Now, any communication is somehow trying to put my story beside your story. You all, each single person in this room, you have a story. It's your own unique story, true for you and for nobody else. And so I thought that probably the best way to start was to tell something of my own story. Now, I've got the same difficulty as Michael. When he invited me to do this, I thought, oh yes, 20 people, upstairs there somewhere, and we'll sit down and have a nice conversation. This just changes everything. The dynamics, I mean, you've all done this, so you can do something with a group of 4 that you can't do with a group of 20. You can do something with a group of 20 that you just cannot do with groups here. For example, I'd had all sorts of brilliant ideas about breaking the group up into small groups of 4 and 5. We really can't do much of that here. There's a few occasions where I can sort of get you talking to the person next to you or the immediate group around you, but not really the kind of thing that I'd envisaged. So I too am just adapting on the run to what's going on here. We have altogether, 10 hours, is it, Michael?
6 hours.
6 hours, okay, 6 hours. Well, we'll have to take a few chapters here together and see. So what I thought I'd do, can I assume, no, let me not put it that way, because that's the wrong way to ask that question. Can you tell me how many of you actually read the book? Yeah, so that's the large majority. And if we took, a couple of chapters at a time, then probably even those of you who haven't could probably read it by the next time. It's just, it obviously makes it a lot easier for me if I can assume that you've actually read the book, and then I don't have to go through every detail in it and tell you what's in the book. And I think we get a lot further if I can do that. So if you've not been able to read it, can I suggest, granted that most have, you saw the hands up, that if you could at least read the chapters we'll be talking about before the coming week, and then we can take that for granted. Okay, well, firstly, to tell you something of the story. In other words, why was this book written and what was I really on about? One of the hardest things, that is where it starts. I could go way, way back into my own very early childhood. But probably the most important place to start would be, I was in the seminary at the age of 12. Now, I look at a 12-year-old boy today and I'm aghast. You know, imagine a 12-year-old boy in a seminary. And in a world where celibacy is the norm and anything else is the exception, and the rather frowned on exception. You know, this is the higher call. This is where you're meant to be. And even to think of alternatives is somehow wrong. Now, I was in that world at the age of 12, at a time when I had no concept whatsoever of the so-called facts of life. I knew nothing. And yet there I was in that world. My father had died the year before. I'll always believe he would never have allowed that to happen, for me to go to the seminary at that age. But he died, and there I was at the age of 12. And I suppose at the time I didn't really realize much, but it's looking back that I see all the gaps that were there. And some of the, let me say, some of the angers that have come out of it. I don't think I'm a terribly angry person, and yet I am aware that there are angers there. I always felt later on, I never chose celibacy. I was in that world at 12 when I didn't even know what it was. And it was just taken for granted. It was always there, but there was never a free choice. Here's this alternative, here's this one, I choose this one. That never happened. And I've had to live with that over all these years since. It was a rarefied world, of course, up at Springwood. I'm not going to dwell on it. It's relevant to my story. It was during those years, not at the seminary, that I did suffer sexual abuse myself. I'm not going to tell that story. I still can't. It's not so much that I'm angry. It's, again, confusion out of it. Because, again, when it happened, I had no idea, really, of what the guy was doing or why he was doing it. It had very profound effects on me, but put up into the attic of my mind. At the age of 18, I was sent over to Rome to study. Great adventure. You know, going off to the seminary at 12 was a great adventure for a 12-year-old. Going off to Rome was certainly a wonderful adventure. You know, we went by ship through the Suez Canal and took a month to get. It was brilliant. And we were in a college with students from 45 different nations. It was the missionary college of the church, so it was from Asia, Africa, almost everywhere except Europe. There were very, very few European students there. It was people from all over the world, and that was absolutely fascinating. I was there, for example, during the time of the Suez War. I was sitting opposite two Egyptians at table. There was an African from the Mau Mau tribe in the group that I was in. I heard about the Korean War from Koreans. I heard about the Vietnamese War from Vietnamese, you know, who'd lived through this, which gave me sort of very particular takes on all of those events. Absolutely fascinating. Then in 1958, I went there in 1955. In 1958, Pope John the 23rd was elected. And like everybody else, I was so enthused. The man before him, Pius XII, this austere, distant figure that you never got near. And it's said he went outside the Vatican, 20 times in 19 years. Pope John went out 20 times in the first month. In fact, you know, joking, they'd put up a sign, you know, traffic hazard, you know, beware of Pope, sort of. And rather than give the difference I thought was summed up. One time he visited, in that first month, he visited the prison in Rome. It's called the Regina Coeli, which means Queen of Heaven prison. You know, but there it is. Everything's got sort of holy names there. he visited there, and now had Pius XII gone to that prison, he would have given an extraordinary learned discourse on the morality of prisons and, etc., etc. Pope John talked about an uncle of his who'd done time for stealing a sheep. Needless to say, this went over with the prisoners, marvellous. They listened, they were enthralled by him. And I was in 1958, I was a 21-year-old, absolutely caught up into this. And then he announced the council. And I was caught up in all the preparations. It was happening right there, where I was. I met, or at least saw, most of the great figures of that council. I was in Rome for 3 of the 4 sessions of the council. And that vision of a new church that came out of it, there were moments there that were so dramatic. It started off, they'd decided to put the scriptures on as the first topic. And some people within the Roman Curia had written a draft, and it was a fairly traditional draft. And then a blind cardinal from Cologne, Cardinal Frings, stood up in the council. He used to write out not write out, but work out his talks, and then someone would translate them into Latin and put them on tape. And he'd listen to the tape until he had it fairly well in his mind. And he stood up in the council, blind, and said, "Schema non placet." The draft is no good. It's not even a basis for discussion. We must throw out that draft and get something different, something that's, gives us a bit more energy, that leads us into the future. It was probably the single most dramatic moment in the whole of the Second Vatican Council. Get rid of this whole draft and let's have something fresh with which to work. And who cared about a tied test match in faraway Brisbane when you had this excitement right next door? Well, these were the same years. And that will always be central to me and to my life. Pope John the 23rd and the Second Vatican Council. I'd have to add, I'm talking about the young people of that age, but then some of you are approaching my age. The President of the United States at the time was John F. Kennedy, and that's not irrelevant. It was called by some the year of the 2 Johns, John the 23rd and John Kennedy. And again, remember the age, the Peace Corps, the we can change the world concept. Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country, which was not John F. Kennedy, by the way. It was George Bernard Shaw who used those words, and Kennedy pinched them. But anyway, here was this excitement coming from these two, that, a new world. We can change this world. We can create a new world. And I became so enthused over all of that. It was so central to everything I believed. And it formed my life and my priesthood for all the following years. I had a great liking for Paul VI, a very different man, shy. I met John the 23rd a few days after he was elected. Cardinal Gilroy visited him and took the few Sydney students with him. And, this was typical. He was in his Satan thing didn't fit him yet because the proper one hadn't been made, and his skull cap kept falling off his bald head. And as the youngest person there, I sort of had the job of picking it up and giving it back to him. And we were introduced to him, and the first papal words ever spoken to me were almost the last, but anyway, certainly the first. He looked at me and said, "Senza baffi," which means literally no moustache. Because I was, young, fresh-faced, and senza baffi. So now this is a pope, so probably infallible words that were... Well, they were true anyway, but I've always remembered those words, senza baffi. That's just the 2 words spoken to me. Anyway, this was typical of... Whereas I met Pope Paul VI some years later, but it was utterly different. It was a meeting of 2 shy people neither of whom really knew quite what to say. And so we sort of communicated in a non-verbal way, but he didn't have the words and I didn't have the words, and so there was nothing much, and he was incapable of, Senzabafi or something like that. That just wasn't him. But what I admired about him was he psychologically probably was not fully in accord with the Second Vatican Council. But he said to himself, the Council has made these decisions, my job is to implement them. And that's what he set out to do. Whether he liked them or not, he set out to implement, and he did a marvelous, many documents come from the 1960s and early 1970s in which he really set out to do that. Now, he'll always be remembered, particularly, of course, because of Humane Vitae. But it's wrong to sum up the whole of Paul VI as solely that. There's more to him. And he did really seriously try to implement the Second Vatican Council. Right up in his last years, he was getting very elderly, and so a lot of the steam ran out, and he became or something of a sad figure. Now then, of course, when he died, the year of the three popes, I suppose, in 1 year, you had John Paul I and then John Paul II. And a very different feeling, atmosphere came over the church. John Paul II was such a gigantic figure in every way. I mean, big physically, big sort of, but also great mind, And to me, it seemed, he said to himself, I didn't ask for this job, but I've got it, so I'm going to take it, and I'm going to change the world. And he set out to do something along that, it was the sheer greatness of it is something you have to admire. And in so many fields, he was great. But at the same time, it has to be said, the council somehow stopped. Even in certain ways went backwards. We went back to a centralized church where all decisions came from the Pope. He seemed to have an enormous belief in his own intellect. Well, good and bad in that, but he seemed to have it into, he could write documents and put them out. This was the teaching of the church. And he did not give structure to a number of things that the council had talked about. So I'll always feel that a lot of the council was lost. And with the new Pope, that line's been continued. These things upset me. My council, I don't use that word, my council was being subverted. That thing that I'd been so enthused about, so much behind, and now here it was somehow being taken away from me. And the way permanence to some of that was given. Look, I'll mention a certain person right now. It's about the only time I will mention him, because this is not about him. But why did Cardinal Pell come to Sydney? Now, at first I said he wouldn't. I said, no, I'd never do that. Then they did, and I stopped to think, and I said, of course. There was never going to be anyone else. Why? Because the Cardinal's hat is here, right? And the Cardinals are the electors of the Pope. So by choosing the people who will be Cardinals, you choose the next Pope. You see what I mean? And they wanted him as the Australian Cardinal. And similar things happened around the world. So that by the time the Cardinals came together to elect a new Pope a few years back, you had a college of Cardinals which was going to elect someone very similar in so many ways to the man he was taking over from. That's anticipating the origin of that particular section of the book where I talk about the College of Cardinals and a different way of forming it, because I want to get away from that kind of thing. Now, in my own story, I went on with my life. I suppose the other big thing that came there, every Sydney student in Rome had to stay on after ordination and do a doctorate in something or other. And a month before I was ordained, Cardinal Gilroy was in Rome, and so I thought, I won't wait, I'll bring it up. I said, what do you want me to do? And he obviously hadn't thought about it, and he said, what would you like to do? I said, Scripture. He said, what would be your second choice? And I said, theology. He says, oh, well, okay, do theology. Now, I then got ordained. That was in November. I got ordained in the December. The following Easter, I'd been away at Easter in a parish north of Rome, Arezzo, and I came back to Rome, and there was a letter waiting for me, and I can still remember it. My dear Father Robinson, in the best interest of the Archdiocese, it would be in the best interest of the Archdiocese if you could see your way clear to devoting yourself to the study of the sacred canons. Yours sincerely, in our Lord, Norman Thomas Cardinal Gilroy. So I ended up a canon lawyer, and I hated it. Anyway, that's the way things were then. Thank God you couldn't do that today, so I ended up with the worst of both worlds. It was done to me, but I could never do it to anyone else. But anyway, I worked in the field of canon law for those years. Then, in 1984, I was made a bishop here in Sydney and had to adapt to that. Then, in the 1980s, the stories of abuse started coming out. It was slow because, you may not be aware, Freud did a backflip on this question. At first he was saying abuse has terrible effects. Then under pressure, he backflipped and said, no, it's not. Now he later changed again, but his backflip had a long-term effect. And then the Kinsey report in the 1950s, which was a report usually credited with the start of the sexual revolution, said that sexual abuse of a child, a minor, is like being frightened by a spider. You get frightened, but you're over it the next day and you get on with life. Now, those two, Freud's backflip and then the Kinsey report, set back our understanding of abuse by years, decades, so that we actually came, or psychologists came, to a better understanding of the effects of physical and psychological abuse than they did of sexual abuse. And it was only in the late 70s that a real realization of the effects of sexual abuse started coming through. So it was only in the 1980s that it started coming out into the public, and I suppose I would have first heard of it really about 86, 87, somewhere there, and then it increased until, I've, in my own mind, I sort of put 1990 as the crossover point. Before that point, I can not forgive, but at least understand someone who hadn't reacted properly. After 1990, I can't see any excuses. It was too well known. In 1994, then, I was appointed by the Australian bishops to the Committee for Professional Standards, and a couple of years later, I was appointed in charge of it, which meant I had the job of leading the national response. I repeat, national response, not the individual response to an individual victim, but the national response to the whole of sexual abuse. And about 2 years into that, I talked with so many victims, hundreds of them. I lost count long ago. And at a certain point, I started realizing that what they were saying, what they were feeling, was talking to things within myself. And then 50 years after it had happened, I took my own abuse down out of the attic and looked at it again. And by the way, for the first time, used the word sexual abuse of it. Before that, it was never a repressed memory. But before that, if someone had asked me, did a man ever do this and this to you, I'd have had to say yes, because it did and I remembered it. But if someone had said to me, were you ever sexually abused, I'd probably have said no, because I really hadn't put those two words to what had happened to me. And it was only then, in about 1996, that I actually did that. And I think I hadn't looked at it because I couldn't look at it, because it caused me too much confusion. Not so much anger. I'm not going into it in detail, okay? Accept that. But just say this much. The man who did it was a stranger. I don't know his name. I have just a vague memory of a man with a little moustache. If he's alive, he'd be 100, so he's probably dead. And if I met him tomorrow, I wouldn't know him. How do you get angry at someone who has no face, no name, no identity? I realised later the anger had got transferred to other people who made me feel helpless. And once again, that became, for me, granted the life I was living, became certain people within the church, you know, who could make me feel helpless. And some of them are very good at that. But anyway, and I found myself in the weird situation of trying to lead the national response while also working through my own very personal story. And when I look back, I find that quite weird, you know, that I was doing these two things. But then I was on the marriage tribunal when I still didn't really know what sex was about. Weird, isn't it? How we get into these things. Anyway, that was an intensely forming experience. It was, I lived with such extraordinary pressure during those years. In that field, you're constantly put into no-win situations. And they never stop. Right now there's a funeral on Saturday in Darwin that you all know about. How would you like to preach at that? What would you say? You know, no win. No matter what you say, you're going to, you know. And yet the man's wife and family are going to be there. And they loved him. So you can't turn your back on them. But I just found that kind of tension, that kind of no-win, was there all over the place. And it did have a really profound effect on me. So when you elect a committee, it's a 3-year term, and you can be elected to 3 terms, so 9 years. So I had the full 9 years. I finished in 2003. And I came out of all of that, and you know, thank God I had sort of enough. I couldn't take any more. I can still listen to a victim. I still do that. I can't go to see a film about abuse. You know, say the recent one, the documentary, Deliver Us from Evil. I have not been able to see it. I haven't gone, I won't be going. I just can't do that. It's too much for me. But when I came out of there, I felt deflated. I felt worn out in many ways. And then I also felt not part of things that were happening right here in my own diocese. And I felt, how to say this, you know, alienated, marginalised, not part of all of that. I spent a couple of years in therapy, and I found that there were 4 great alienations in my life. I'd been away from Australia too long, and I didn't feel fully Australian. The abuse had caused me alienated from my own sex, so I have problems relating with men, and I relate with women much better, because men are threatening. That was one of the effects of the abuse, and I felt I wasn't a man like other men. That would take us too close into what happened, and I won't do that. I felt alienated somehow from the whole of society. That was mainly celibacy had that effect, as though, you know, I was the different one. It's not just priests who feel that. A divorced person could feel that. You know, people move in a circle of friends, and married people move in a circle of married friends. And if there's a party, they'll invite their married friends. And it's the single person who gets left out. And I felt that. And then I felt alienated from my own church. Now, they're 4 pretty powerful alienations. to try to live with. So, sorry, I've missed over one important fact in my life. In 1992, Christmas Eve, I had a sudden coronary bypass. And the doctor said to me a bit later, he said, we had it then because otherwise we thought you mightn't reach Christmas. And this was Christmas Eve. So I had it then, and it really was one of the most deeply spiritual moments in my life. I can remember waking up, and I knew instantly where I was and what had happened, and my very first thought was, I'm alive. And then the second thought, a fraction of a second later, was gratitude to God and to the doctors. Not in that order, just both of them, God and the doctors, that I was here. And it became very powerful because I always, since that day, I've always had a far deeper sense of life as gift. You know, I've talked this over with other people who've had bypasses, and they say the same thing. Life as gift, and life as meant to be used. And why it's important is because I did feel freer after that moment to be myself. Instead of the good little boy sort of thing, I felt freer to be myself, to do what I felt was right. And I'm glad in that sense, because that helped me through the whole abuse crisis, and it helped me at the end of it. And anyway, I made the decision that with all the thoughts that were running through my head, I was finding it difficult to continue as a bishop, but in a doubling particular way, impossibly difficult to continue as a bishop in Sydney. So to resign, you have to offer your resignation, the Pope has to accept it. I offered mine that was accepted in record time. Well, that's simple fact. It was back within a month, and most of that time was the postage going back and forth. So clearly there were other people who were just as glad that I retired as I was. And then I set out to write this book. Now, I didn't want to write it before. I mean, I've had a few accusations since it's been published. One of them was, well, why did he wait till he retired? Why didn't he write it while he was still in office? But the answer to that one is I didn't want to write simply an angry book. I wanted to sit down and think and be able to research and look up other, and finally write, something that I could really take responsibility for, something that was really mine. And so I needed to have that time. And it was, I tried to spend most of the last 3 years then researching and writing the book. It was also a journey of coming to terms with the abuse and of that subtitle, The Spirit of Jesus, trying to find out where that really existed in my life. The abuse issue is not finished. Far from it. In fact, that's my greatest fear at the moment, that we've sort of managed it, in that we've set up systems to respond to victims, and it's been good, bad, and indifferent as to what's actually happened in practice. But one way and another, we've managed it. It has to be said, we got out of it a lot lighter than did the United States or Canada or Ireland, who've had it far worse than we did. And there was a whole group of people working, but I'll take part of the credit for it because I was the leader for much of that time, and because we did succeed in coming very close to a national response, and that helped us. Whereas what happened in the States, they were too big to have a national response. See, you couldn't just have the conference decide by majority vote. Every bishop and every superior religious congregation had to agree. So we needed the unanimous vote of 180 people. Now in the States, that would have been the unanimous vote of well over 1,000 people. And they didn't even try to get it because they knew they wouldn't. So what happened was each diocese and each religious order was following its own system. And when you do that, the inevitable result, you'll be judged by your worst cases. And that's what happened. Their worst case happened to be Boston. And so that's what the whole nation ended up getting judged by. We avoided that because we had a national response. I've always believed that to be true. No matter how bad it was here, thank God it was a lot worse elsewhere. But if we've managed it, we have not got to the bottom of it. We have not done the studies to find the real causes, and that's where in the book I suggest the best idea I've heard is that there are three things coming together: unhealthy psychology, unhealthy ideas about power and sex, and an unhealthy living environment. And that we need to investigate all three in order to begin to come to some understanding. But this is where I find the bishops are tied, their hands behind their back, because they can't put on the table the things that have to be put on the table. Celibacy, it's not the sole cause, far from it, but it has contributed. In various different ways, it has contributed. The process by which, priesthoods are formed, seminaries sort of cut off from the world, that needs to be looked at. But it's only the Pope who can put it on the line. Now, sadly, the two popes, as this is concerned, the last two, particularly the first one, John Paul II, he was Pope for all that time, he did not confront it. I'm sorry to say that, I wish I could say different, but no matter how I look at it, he didn't. And that's the symptom of that is there were two particular cases that were on his desk and no one else's. And they were of the Cardinal Archbishop of Vienna at the time, not the present man, a Cardinal Groer, G-R-O-E-R, hard name to pronounce. And the other one was the founder of the so-called Legionaries of Christ, which is a movement similar to Opus Dei, but quite distinct from it. It's a separate movement. And that was a name by the name of Maciel del Golado. Against both of them, many accusations were made, from times when they were in the seminary, and the complaints came from students in the seminary at the time that they were rector. Now, because one was a cardinal and the other was a founder of religious order, it was the Pope who needed to look at those two cases. And sadly, for a period of over 10 years, he simply didn't do anything about them at all. The pressure was applied to the man in Vienna, not from the Pope, from other people, and he did eventually resign. He may have turned 75 by that stage. He died by the time the new Pope came. And in fairness to him, the new Pope then did set up a tribunal to look at the other man, the founder of Legionaries of Christ, and he was found guilty, and the Pope took appropriate action, removed him. So that's a good thing the new Pope has done. But then, within the last month, that same Pope has visited Austria, which is, the Cardinal Archbishop had been guilty, and the country had been torn apart. And the Pope spoke about all sorts of things, but didn't mention sexual abuse. And I long ago found out that you can't deal with it by silence. You've got to face it. If it's occurred in a parish, the new parish priest has got to confront it. The priest who's preaching on Saturday up in Darwin, he can't just talk about other matters as though this didn't exist. He knows, because I've spoken with him, that he's got to confront it. And you have to, there this new Pope has done one really good thing, but one thing which I find inexplicable. So we're still waiting for that. Now, it seems to me that the basis of the book is that abuse, more than anything else, gives the energy for change within the church. There are any number of people saying, this is not good enough. We have to look at all of these issues. We have to put them on the table. If you were to ask any of the Australian bishops, are you satisfied that we've found the most fundamental causes of abuse? Are you satisfied that celibacy has absolutely nothing to do with abuse? Are you satisfied that training people in seminaries is the best way to do it? I think most of them would answer no. They know there's more to do. but I think they're embarrassed because they can't do it. It's got to be the Pope who puts it on the table, who says, for example, well, okay, people are saying that celibacy has contributed. Let's discuss it. But instead he's already on record as saying celibacy will not be changed. And it's not celibacy, by the way, it's obligatory celibacy that is the question. He's already said that will not be changed. So the bishops are unable to grasp, unable to get into the things that really need to be done. There's more they could do, and I want to see if they can be got to do them. But I think it's a mistake to put all our energy into them. Now, I've said this is story speaking to story. If I were to take it further with any single one of you, I would now have to say, what's your story? And I'd have to sit and listen to your story. And then we could really have a conversation. And if you want to know anyone, listen to their story. I've only told you a tiny part of mine, of course. There's a lot more. I won't bore you with it. But if you want to know what this book's about, where it comes from, what it's trying to answer, then this is something of that answer. When I say we've gone back on the Second Vatican Council, there was 1,000 years of history to drag us back. And what we've done is somehow gone back to that. At the same time, Vatican II was less than perfect. It's page after page you find compromise. And you find this normal method of dealing with problems to give something to both sides. So you've got a statement here, and you've got a statement on the other, and they somehow contradict, classic example is the one I quoted about the sensus fidelium, the sense that all, the instinct for truth that all Christian people have. But if you take what the Vatican Council says, then it ends up being, yes, the sense of the instinct for the truth that all people have is infallible. But informing it, people must listen to the Pope and the bishops. So it's sort of giving with one hand, taking back with the next. And that you'll find again and again and again through. So it was all too easy, sadly, to quote one side rather than the other. And we've had a church which is some people quoting one lot of phrases out of Vatican II and the other lot quoting another lot of phrases. And we still have to really put them together. What people need to be allowed to grieve for is the loss of some of the certainties. That they seem to be there where you didn't have to think. A pope made all the decisions for you, told you what to do, and you just did it. Now, a lot of people do have to grieve for the loss of that. Because there were people who were comfortable in that world. Everybody's got a story. I keep repeating that. I'll never forget the first parish I was in, this was the 1960s. And I was in the parish of Croydon, and the liturgy was all new, and I was all enthused over this. We were going to have this magnificent liturgy. And I went around and visited family, and I visited this lady, and she said, oh, I don't like this new liturgy, don't like it at all. She says, I far prefer the old liturgy, because I could sit there in perfect peace and quiet and plan the family menu for the whole week. Now, that was the best lesson on the liturgy I ever had. That's where she was at. And I'm not going to quarrel. I mean, this is a woman busy as can be, looking after her kids, and that bit at Mass gave her a chance to plan, in quiet to plan the family. Okay, I've got to accept people as they are, their psychological, where they come from, their story. The answer to abuse is not to be found in canon law. That is, you need a process to respond to victims.
And it has to be a process that's sympathetic, that listens to people, but at the same time is not going to condemn priests without even listening to them. That's hard to do. Victims, it's important to them that you believe them, obviously. And they won't come forward at all unless they believe that there's someone who will really listen sympathetically. It's still true to say that the majority of victims have not come forward. I'm quite certain of that from what I've seen. The majority have not come forward. And the principal reason is they're afraid. That, now, on the other hand, we are getting increasing criticisms from all priests that we are judging priests guilty without proper evidence. And to meet that, to get a balance between those two is, well, I can't find it. I've tried and I can't find it. So how to get the proper procedure? The church in Rome has got a process, but it's to me not good. It's too... They simply went back to a traditional process, and I don't think you can do that. I think you've got to invent a totally new one to meet this very particular situation. So I'm not happy with there's more work to do. But you won't find it simply in law. You've got to find it in somehow reaching out to victims. The sort of problem you raised. What's happened today is certain groups have got on to victims and said, don't look for anything else, just look for money. Now that's bad advice to a victim. I know a victim I had a lot of dealings with, and he got a very good settlement. And that night he rang me and he said, it's only money. And I knew exactly what he meant. It didn't take away the pain. And there are two, my experience would be that the two things that victims want above all is someone to say sorry in the strong sense of that word. That is, what happened to you was wrong, and you were not to blame. Someone abused power in relation to you, and you were the victim. And the second thing they want is someone to promise it won't happen again, directly to them, but also they want the promise that everything will be done to make sure it happens to nobody else as well. Now, they're the two that you need above all. I've said sorry to victims so many times that I've lost count, but always felt that wouldn't it have been so much better if the Pope had actually used the word sorry, and he hasn't. Popes I've seen to have as much problem about that word as John Howard does. And yet we need that word. Again, I've said that. I felt time and again I was out there trying to do this without the support from on high that I really needed. It would have been so much better if it had, that right from the top it had said, let's all work together on this. And I really believe because the Pope didn't do that, the church fractured. So that in Australia, as everywhere else, I've seen responses that were brilliant. I couldn't fault. But I've also seen the opposite extreme. And I've seen everything in between. That's, the Pope is the rock, and the rock holds the church together. Not just in doctrine, you must all believe this, but in something like this. There's been no bigger crisis for a very long time in the church. And I will, to my dying day, believe the rock did not carry out its essential duty of holding the church together in that crisis. It gives me no pleasure to say that, but I have to say it.
Thank you for the wonderful book and for that wonderful introduction. As you can all hear, I'm an American, and, well, I'm an Australian as well, and also a Catholic. Now, it's a little bit like Sammy Davis Jr., if any of you are old enough to remember him, who described himself as a black one-eyed Jew. Being in today's world as an American and a Catholic, if anyone went to the Blake Prize, you might have seen that there were a lot of very spiritual works about Islam and about Buddhism. The Christian works, however, were insulting in every way. In fact, quite a few people noted that in the book, the little booklet at the door. So they said you couldn't do these things with these other religions, so you do it to Christianity. Now, if I'm not, I don't like to defend certainly American foreign policy now, I don't like to defend aspects of the church, but people are often asking me about these things. And I can say, well, there's another side to what is in the headlines in the newspapers in both cases. And what the other side in politics as an American is that I have a vote. I can cast my vote. As little as that is, I can also cast my vote here because I'm a dual national. But what can we do within the church? We don't have a vote. Do we have any voice? And how can we do something to hopefully make some of the changes that you're advocating?
Yes, it's a newspaper editor who's a Catholic in Australia who said that prejudice against Catholics is the last politically correct prejudice in Australia. I think there's a truth there. You're allowed to be you're still politically correct, but you're allowed to be prejudiced and say what you like about, well, you know, there's a truth there. And yet it's also true we brought a lot of that on ourselves. You know, a very dogmatic church laying down the law for everybody else, and then seen to have feet of clay, you know, particularly through the sexual abuse issue. What can you do? I'm asked that again and again and again. This is a difficult question, yes. I'm not holding my breath till, you know, vast change occurs. My personal belief is the best way to do it is to get a conversation going. Now, it's a slow process, but to build, the more, you know, that's, if you like, the reason behind the book, to give people some things to talk about. And, you know, I think a lot of people try to shortcut it by saying what we need to do is protest to the bishops and make them do the... Well, that really won't work. I mean, I've been on both sides of this equation, remember. And confronting bishops, see, they are ultimately powerless, I mean that, to change a lot of the things I've talked about. A bishop can't allow a priest to get married tomorrow. It's the Pope who would have to put that one on the table. So I don't see that, you know, the confrontation is the way to go. I see the conversation. The more people are aware of issues, the more they have intelligent ideas on the subject, the more we can hope for change. I do think there's a number of, you know, I've already suggested a number of questions that could be asked of bishops, yes, here in Australia. You know, are you satisfied that we've done everything possible to find the basic causes of this problem and to change them? I think, you know, most of them would answer no, we haven't. And we could talk about what might be done. We'd come very quickly up against that point of what they can't do and only the Pope can do. But I think if we can get a conversation going, we can hope for something sometime. But I've probably had, certainly not in my lifetime, probably not in yours.
Alan Hogan. There are a group of us here who, when we were a lot younger, had experience of the Cardine theory of see, judge and act. We've looked at, with the help of your book, at our church. We've judged that it does not accord at the moment with the mind of Christ. We then say, well, we've got to do something about it. And your suggestion is that there be a conversation. We're very good at having a conversation with each other, but part of the conversation has got to be from us to our leaders, the bishops. The way in which it is done must be tactful. It may even be better, as you suggest, to ask them questions. But I think we've got to find some mechanism to enable our bishops to understand just how many of us there are who agree with what you say in the book. And is it really true that there is absolutely nothing they can do about it? Because then the next stage is, if all the Australian bishops fed to the Pope the degree of dissatisfaction with the present system that exists in Australia, might that not perhaps persuade the Pope at least to listen and to think?
Alan, there are actually a number of things I'd need to say in reply to that. When I say conversation, I don't just mean conversation with like-minded people. with people who agree with you already. I'm in conversation with people who disagree with you. I also mean, see, the media would often have it that the Catholic Church is split between progressives and conservatives. Can I suggest that that leaves out at least half the church in the middle, who are neither progressive nor conservative, who maybe go to Mass, maybe have their kids baptised, just possibly get married in church, and may get buried from church. They use the church. I'm not blaming them, by the way. A lot of them are very busy with their families, etc. But they don't particularly care who's bishop because they have nothing to do with him and don't want to. They don't care who's pope because they have nothing to do with him. These are some of the people that one needs to talk with and convince. Otherwise, I fear that, when you say, the very many people who want change, it's my personal belief that both the progressives and the conservatives are minorities, because the majority is that big block in the middle. This is my theory. You may obviously disagree with it. Now, you ask the question, can the bishops do anything? Yes, of course. They could set a lot of things in place for dialogue. One could take up that idea from the Vatican Council of the sensus fidelium, this instinct for the truth of all people, and ask them what's being done to tap into that within our country. A whole lot of things could be set in place. As for their then influence in Rome, I have to say a few things. Firstly, you're not going to get all the bishops on your side. There will be, there'll be a number who won't. Secondly, you won't believe this, but it's true. Rome considers the Australian bishops to be among the most rebellious and disobedient in the world. Yeah, okay, laugh. Laugh, but it's true. We've had numerous proofs of this. Look, I'm only going to mention a couple whom you know about already. Pat Power you all know about, John Heaps, you know his book. Now I've written this book, there's 3 for a start. But there are others, there are a number of others who are in the gun. And at one stage there, this was all that whole story of the Statement of Conclusions back in 1998 was about all the terrible abuses in this country. So that will they listen to the Australian bishops? No. As a group, they're sort of dismissed. And yet people laugh, I know, when you talk of the Australian bishops as radical, but Rome considers them so. It's something of that Australian thing, being blunt, speaking up, and they don't like that. So I wish I could give you a simple formula is what I'm saying, and I can't. So I am, and I still talk about the need to talk with others, not just those like-minded. Again, if the whole of the Australian Catholic people thought the same way, then the bishops would have something much stronger to go on. Cardinal Pell will tell you, I'm talked with any number of Australian Catholics and they all agree with me. Well, yeah, you do tend to talk with the people who agree with you, don't you? Whichever side you're on. I was here, I was a bishop when Pope John Paul came out in, 1986, and then again in 1995. We had a meeting with him. We had a lunch with him on both occasions. But on both occasions, he sat down and read us a prepared speech. Now, this is the Australian bishops I'm talking about. A bit of dialogue at table with those immediately around him, but no dialogue with the bishops as such. It was a prepared speech that he read out to us. You've got to have dialogue between Pope and bishops before you're going to get very much with, I'm afraid, with you. If he won't talk with the bishops, then how much chance have you got? I can put it that way. I don't really believe confrontation achieves very much. Remember, again, I've been on both sides. I worked as a bishop for 20 years. I had any number of banners thrown at me. I was chairman of the schools board here. We had to close down a number of schools. Oh boy, I got picketed getting into, all kinds of, and the banners simply put you under pressure, and they don't really entice you to conversation. So I'm not a great believer in banners. Plus, I'm afraid, I don't know about you, but I see these things on television, including last night, of people walking along the street, what do we want, such and such, where do we want it now? And I can't think of a single slogan that I'd be prepared to march that way for. You know, what do we want? Love and peace, yes, but, you know, what sort of protest would that be? What I wanted to do today is simply go through the book, sort of chapter at a time. I'll give a very brief introduction to it, and then see what questions you might have out of that. We'll try to let things go where they will, but we'll try to follow something of that pattern. So we'll start at chapter 2, which is about the two books of God. And I've said the two great sources of our religious knowledge are the Bible and the world around us, because God created this world, and all creation is revelation. We know a lot about Shakespeare from what he wrote. We know a lot about Michelangelo from the statues and the paintings that he produced. And so we know a lot about God from the world that God produced, the world out there, but the world within ourselves as well. Now, of course, I do not exclude the idea that God can somehow speak to me directly, but I think that we have to be very careful of revelation that comes through individuals. As you well know, there are any number of people claiming revelations from God, but we're always pretty suspicious of them, aren't we? You know, if one of them suddenly said tomorrow, I've discovered a fourth person of the Trinity, we might be a little hesitant to accept that and say, we'll stay with the Bible on that question rather than jump to a fourth person. So I've looked at the Bible and then at the world around us. In relation to the Bible, we've had a problem over 2,000 years, I think, of people claiming too much certainty out of the Bible, as though it was directly written by God, every word was coming straight from God, and we didn't pay sufficient attention to the human beings who wrote it. So the points that I make briefly are, firstly, it's the story of a journey. And there's a beginning to that story, and there's a middle, and there's an end. The end is with Jesus. That's the great high point of the whole story. But the beginning is some very ordinary people. One of them I quote later in the book, a gentleman called Lamech, who wanted 77-fold vengeance for any wrong done to him. I killed a boy for wounding me, a man for striking me, 77-fold vengeance. This is not exactly the way we're supposed to behave. So we can't just take those phrases out of the Bible and say, this is me. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. No, that's still a primitive level of morality. In our understanding of God, there are false ideas, and then very gradually a refining until we come to the ideas of Jesus, of a God of infinite love for all people, not in his words, but in his actions, in his death on the cross. So it's the story of a journey. And I think the Bible makes a lot more sense to us when we can see it in those terms. Secondly, much of it is told in stories. As I put it here, talking in pictures. That was a phrase I borrowed from Patrick Dodson, who told that story about himself when he was talking to a group of Aborigines, and one of the elders sat beside him and started interrupting. Talk in pictures, talk in pictures. Well, the Bible talks in pictures. Now, it's then difficult at times to separate what's supposed to be an actual event and what's a story. And it's not, sometimes they're mixed together, and it's quite hard to do so. This is where, okay, we look to the scholars for a lot of this. But much of it is stories. Sometimes we have a story which, if someone wishes to believe it's a literal truth, fine, not a problem to me. So if someone wishes to believe that Moses held out his hands and the waters parted and the people walked through dry shod, fine, I have no problem with if you wish to believe that. There are other times I do have a problem. I've quoted a case from the book of Samuel where David counted the people, and it said that God got so angry over this counting because it implied a reliance on human strength, that God slaughtered 70,000. Well, if you want to take that literally, I have a problem, because that's not the kind of God I believe in. who would slaughter 70,000 people, not because they'd done anything wrong, but because the king had conducted a census and counted the people. So I think we have to always use our intelligence. Inspiration, I've then argued that yes, there's inspiration, but it varies. It depended on the individual as to how open they were to God. Of course, it depended on the individual how good they were at writing stories or expressing in a poetic manner the insight that they had. So there are all these degrees, and yet the whole Bible is inspired because that's the kind of Bible God wanted. God did not want a book of final truths and nothing but. God wanted this story of a journey told in very human terms, and that's what we have. So I then say that the essential truth concerning the Bible is that it is the foundation of our religious belief. That story is, with all its ups and downs, and that to be a Christian means to be in constant dialogue, constant conversation with that story. We're constantly going back to it. Obviously, above all, we're going back as Christians to the person of Jesus Christ, the story of his life and death. We're constantly going back to that. But we're also going back to the Old Testament and the story that gradually unfolds there. I think this is a richer basis, ultimately, on which to see the Bible. If you take it as a book of final truths, then you end up as a fundamentalist. And then you get into a lot of very difficult problems. And the future, I think, lies in that deep and constant conversation with the Bible.
On what you're saying there, Jeff, it occurs to me that there are other revelations of God outside our actual scriptures. Would you agree with that? Like in other scriptures of other faiths, other denominations? Just as there's a revelation of God in a sunset, in beautiful mountains, in the speech and circumstances around us.
You're talking, I think, directly about God revealed through the world around us. Yes, so I see God in a sunset or whatever it may be. That's God in the world around us. If we come to the scriptures of other religions, the Quran, the Bhagavad Gita, the various scriptures that we've got, that's a harder question. And I'm really not competent to answer as to whether there are insights there that we might call revelation. I can't exclude it because I can't tell God what to do. If God wants to reveal something to the Lord Buddha, that's up to God, not up to me. So I can't absolutely exclude the very concept, but I also can't affirm it.
On that particular point, Jeff, John Paul II in his encyclical Redemptoris Missio has a very, very interesting paragraph. I think it's paragraph 24, where he talks about the activity of the Spirit. He's quoting Gaudium et Spes, actually, and how we must be open to revelation from multiple sources, the scriptures being a particular instance, but not the only instance.
I've no problem with the idea that God is present with individuals in their looking at the sunset, and that there's a presence of God is not a problem to me. Whether we can specifically talk revelation, I think I'll leave to other people. Well, I'll take it a little bit further. I talk in that same chapter about the world around us as revealing God. And I've done it through two examples, but you could take many others. Say, when we come to questions of parenthood. Now, there have been changes, haven't there, in our lifetime, in our understanding of parenthood. Years ago, fairly fixed roles for father, mother. A better understanding now that the two need to work together more than perhaps was realized before. And then I've suggested that when we read the Bible, we can put our ideas concerning parenthood in there and interpreting the parenthood of God. And we can do the exact opposite. We can take what the Bible says about God's parenthood and apply that to human parents. And I've suggested that we need to learn what the Bible says, we need to learn from the world around us, and then put the two together. So they're complementary sources of our understanding of God. I've used the example also of structures in the church. We can look at the Bible and say, here's the structure that Jesus gave, but we've learned a great deal about how societies work today. We've learned a great deal about the structures that help and the structures that don't. And again, we need to put these two sources of our knowledge together. And I'd really say that over the last 2,000 years, there probably hasn't been nearly enough attention given to this second element of what we can learn from God, from the world around us, and most importantly, the world within me. You know, all the hopes, desires, feelings, thoughts that I have, that can tell me much about God as well. These are the two great sources. Then I go on to talk about applying them, and this famous word tradition. And I've tried to explain what it is and what it isn't, because I find that when you pick up and read something, the word tradition is used in many different ways. And I've tried to give some clarity of meaning to what it is. It's firstly the process. The earliest disciples wanted to hand on, in Latin tradere, from which we get the word tradition. They wanted to hand on the person and the story of Jesus. And so they went out, and eventually they wrote the scriptures as part of that handing on. But then down through the centuries, we've had the two things. We've had the process of the handing on, and we also have the content of what is handed on. And there I felt a need to make a distinction between the great tradition, which is the handing on of the person and the story of Jesus, and then traditions with a small t and in the plural, all the different truths that we've eventually come to realize that we recite in the creed and that we have gradually accumulated. And I've suggested that this can be put beside the two sources of the Bible and the world around us, but not as its equal, because it's a human thing. But it can be put there. And I've eventually suggested that we must try to combine the three, and we must seek a truth that is in agreement with the Bible, is in agreement with the world around us, and that basically respects our tradition as well. And that we use each of the three in interpreting the other, so that it's not right to use the Bible in a fundamentalist way to beat people around the head and say, this is what you must believe the Bible says. Now, we can't do that, but equally we can't put tradition so exalted that it controls the Bible. That's not right. We've got to use the three in a dialogue with each other.
Jeff, could you say a little bit more about the mechanism by which tradition happens, the authentic passing on, whether it's by way of the content or the process?
Well, the process is what happens. Parents talk to their little children about God, teach them to pray. This is tradition. This is tradition really alive. This handing on of the person and the story of Jesus. But then one hopes it also happens in church on Sunday. One hopes it also happens in papal encyclicals. So there are all these different levels of tradition going on at one and the same time. Needless to say, after the eventual point to some of it as really authentic, standing the test of time, other things you won't. I mean, at every level. Did I tell a story here? I was out to dinner once with a family, and I thought they were very sort of modern in their faith and in everything they did. And then in the middle of the meal, the mother said,
God doesn't like little boys who don't eat their spinach. Now, we're back to a very angry God there. I do understand something of the sheer frustration of parents trying to get kids to eat spinach. I understand that. And I understand that you'll drag anything in to get them to eat the damn stuff. Because it's, actually I like spinach, but it's good for them. And then when presidents of the United States themselves tell you they don't like broccoli, that doesn't help you. But nevertheless, at that moment, she brought in an angry God. Now, this was not an authentic tradition. Faith was not being passed on at that moment because the child was being given an idea of a severe God, an angry God, a punishing God, who would get angry if I don't eat my spinach. So tradition, yes, it's good and bad. And of course, the same word tradere in Latin has two meanings. One is to hand on, the other is to betray. And so it's very easy in handing on to end up betraying by going too far. I think I quote the example there of a priest, I do still remember this, years ago now, back in the late 60s actually, who in an attempt to be really modern, celebrated Mass with a pizza and a can of beer. This was Australian culture, you see. Now, was that tradition? Was that handing on the authentic message of Jesus Christ? I personally did not think so. He was trying to be, modern culture, but I think he was betraying rather than handing on.
Whilst I'm getting to the other questioner, Geoff, let me tell a story. One of my students at Hunters Hill a number of years ago was from Indonesia. And he said, we don't grow wheat or we don't grow grapes. It's not part of our tradition, not part of our culture. And another priest from the Philippines said to me, he was a bit bolshy, but I'll say what he said anyway. He said, bread and wine are the food of the conquerors and the oppressors. I think this raises some fairly significant kinds of questions about symbolism and whether or not what is being passed on is actually what we want to be passed on. Would you care to comment on that?
Yes, just staying within Australia, for the first 150 years of white Australia, wine was not really part of our culture. So the concept of wine was really borrowed from another country. But, sometimes I think we have to do this. To be authentic to what Jesus did, I think we have to become a bit Mediterranean, a bit Middle Eastern, where wine and unleavened bread are very ordinary. So, yes, but any talk of us and the Bible, us and God, we have to move as well. We can't sit here and say, I'm, Australian 2007, and God had better come to me. I need to move as well. And I have to move outside my comfort zone and sometimes accept symbols and ideas that come from elsewhere. As to what should happen in Asia in relation to the Mass, I'd be hesitant to say that they should abandon bread and wine and do it with rice and sake or something. I personally would be very hesitant.
If I don't know that there's actually an answer to this question, but it came up when you were talking about tradition. As an educator of many years, sometimes when you say what the tradition is, it's misheard. That depends on the readiness of the people who hear it.
As you well know, in all circumstances, there is always a problem in conveying thoughts and feelings from my head to someone else's. You've all heard the story of, I told the story to this gentleman sitting in front of me, quietly, so no one else could hear it, and then he told that story to the person next to him, and she told it. So by the time it got to the end of the second row, how much of the original story would be left? Because we always interpret
in passing on a story. We don't hear just the facts, we hear meaning. And then we give it a meaning which relates to me, and then the next person gives a meaning which relates to that person, and so on. So that's happening all the time. I know of no real way. You've taught as I've taught, and you spend the most time doing it as carefully as you can, and then you set an exam and they write back answers and you think, my God, where did that come from? There's nothing there that I said. How on earth did this? But we interpret the way we hear what we want to hear. We believe what we want to believe. There's great debates today with all the sort of atheists, Richard Dawkins and the others. And I've always believed that whether people believe in God or not depends on two factors above all others. One is their own personal history, and the second is whether they want to believe in God. And those who want to believe in God do, and those who do not want to end up not doing so. And both would claim they were all being terribly rational, but in fact it was the wanting that came first and that in many ways affected what came after.
First, thank you. And I agree with you about bread and wine because I am from France and from Bordeaux. But please, could you please speak about the Ten Commandments?
The question concerns the Ten Commandments. I do contain that in a later chapter where I see it as part of that story of the journey. And there that's purely me, by the way, those 6 sort of stages that I see in the Bible. You can find more if you wish. But starting with Lamech and 77-fold vengeance, moving up to another stage of an eye for an eye, tooth for tooth, the limit, that being, the point being no more than one tooth for one tooth. Then I saw a 4th stage of usefulness, so that I relate to people on the basis of what's in it for me. But then we came to the great giant step up of the Old Testament, which was the Ten Commandments, because they were based on rights and on dignity. And they said, I must at all times and in all ways respect your dignity. And then so it came to the social commandments, and it said that there are 4 things above all. I must not kill you or harm you physically. I must not harm your relationships, your relationship with husband, with parents, with children, brothers, sisters, friends. I must not steal your possessions, and I must not harm your good name by bearing false witness. And then it adds, don't covet, don't even think of doing these things. So the Ten Commandments have a really important place. Jesus never did away with them. They were always there. He built higher on, he talked about loving others and then loving as God loves, the higher stages. But he never did away with the Ten Commandments, because if I wish to love you, I must first respect you. If I don't respect you, I don't love you. Forget all talk of love. In a marriage or anywhere else, if someone says, I love you, but really there's no respect for basic rights going on, then something's really radically wrong, and one has to question the genuineness of any love that's there. So the Ten Commandments are really, really important in that whole story, and Jesus never left them behind. Okay, then the next chapter talks about the relationship, really, I suppose you can sum it up this way, between the church and the kingdom or the reign of God. And it's interesting, isn't it? Jesus did not talk about a church. The word occurs 3 times in the Gospels and in particular contexts, and it doesn't seem to have a particularly specialist meaning. It means the community, the coming together, the congregation, the sum of the followers of Jesus. Otherwise, he did not talk about church. He talked constantly about the kingdom or the reign of God, and that's what he wanted. And that's what I try to look at in that chapter. I'm using the work largely of someone who died recently, but some of you would know him, Charles Hill, whom I gained a lot from Charles. When I could understand him, I gained a great deal. I know he's a great man. And he took up those three terms that occur in the New Testament of mysterion, the really God's eternal plan, of koinonia or communion, and then basileia or kingdom or reign. And he talks, putting them together, coming up with the idea of an eternal plan of God, of a sharing with us of all God had through the reign of God within our hearts. And that's what Jesus wanted. That's what he worked for. That's what he talked about. Now, he had followers, yes, so he did not exclude the concept of church. Far from it, on the contrary. But the church was a means to an end. The end was this reign of God within our hearts, of the whole world, by the way. And the church was a means to that end, and never more. But we can get them upside down, can't we? And we can talk about as though our job was spreading the church, glorifying the church. You know, everything was church-oriented. And we'd judge our success by the numbers of people we got into the church around the world. And that really wasn't the language Jesus spoke. So I've tried to put those two concepts together and accent that concept of the reign of God, and see the church as a sign of that reign, yes, and the better sign it can be, so much the better, but only a sign. And there are times when it fails dismally to be a good sign. And to come back to the origin of this book, the whole sexual abuse crisis, the church was not a sign, was just not a sign of the kingdom, not in that, and not in so many ways throughout that period and still today. That's why I've argued in the whole book, we really, really have to confront that so that we may again become a sign of the kingdom in a far better way than we are managing at the moment. Unless we really confront it and root it out as best we can, then we are not being the true sign. I've also argued in that chapter that there's a hierarchy of holiness. The Mother Teresas of this world, or whoever. And they have an authority that a Pope can never have. And that's not to downplay the Pope, but the Pope's an external authority. And the hierarchy of holiness is something that we really need to turn to. Anyway, it's brief, it's only a few pages, but I just felt that chapter needed to be in there, so that we're talking about what Jesus put first, and what we should all be working for. And it puts us in our place. Instead of aggrandizing the church, we should be humbly working for the kingdom. Remember, I talk in a later chapter that for the best part of, well, certainly 1,000 years, but one could argue for longer than that, the church got involved in an external kingdom. A Christian empire, a Christian society, which then used coercive means to make people conform to its ideas. And I've suggested that in our day, we've had to break right away from that and come back to a much more humble role in helping this eternal plan of God for a sharing in God's life through the reign of God within my heart. And that's really very different from what took place over much of the church's history.
I hope I'm on the topic when I say that. I love your book. I love your book, and it resonates so much with me. But I think, as you say, I think we need a big switch because things in the past and now are pretty different. Also, talking about the reign of God, I think we're really talking about spiritual leadership, which means giving meaning, and a meaning that Jesus was talking about to our life. And I'm just wondering, as a proposition, if we could have, more than having what we had in the past as far as priests and nuns and people in the church, have people after the year of 50, both men and women, taking on that role. I mean, even when Jesus was alive, life expectancy was about 40, 45. Even Jesus was actually quite old when he took on that role. And I just wonder if nowadays we could have more people in their 50 plus, both men and women, taking on that role, which would be more a leadership on spirituality, on the meaning that we give to life. And I think you have to be able to, when you have that position, to look back on your own life to help other people.
I take up your idea. I wouldn't exclude it to people over 50. I mean, there's no reason why a 20-year-old can't be a deeply spiritual person. And of course, there are people in history, you know, recently, I suppose, Therese of Lisieux died at 24. There are other examples of people who somehow were brilliantly in touch with God. Catherine of Siena was a wonderful example. She told popes what to do, and they listened. You know, to this 27-year-old, you know, she wrote to a pope. He was called Pope Urban VI. I mentioned him. He was the most irascible pope in all history. And she wrote to him, Pope Urban, and said, "You are urbane in name, but not in nature." Now, this is a 27-year-old girl writing to a pope, and he listened. So, the age wouldn't worry me. Look, I'd love to see more of the hierarchy of holiness today. I'd love to see us appreciate and seek out, you know, dangerous business, because we mustn't turn them into gods or gurus on a mountaintop. But there are people whom you've met, whom you say to yourself, gosh, there's something special there. There's a holiness there, which I really respect and I'm willing, I love to listen to. Well, I'd love to see us really cultivate this far more than we do. And I'd love to see those people become, yes, as you say, more important than bishops.
No, what I'm meaning is that we have a crisis in having priests, people who can actually help other people to develop the meaning of their lives. And basically what I'm just saying, there's a huge amount of people there available for the role in spiritual leadership. And I always think as a second part of their lives. Because I have met a lot of priests where obviously they became priests when they were 25, 26. They were put into a role where a lot of them could not assume that role. So they pretend to be able to, you know, and you can't blame them. You know, they've been put in this role with a lot of responsibility to talk about marriage things, about all those sort of things, where honestly, to be honest, I think they are totally incapable of. But because the role has been put onto them, they have to perform. While I think a lot of people who choose after they've had their own lives to then go into helping others, I think would actually be more productive.
Few things. I'm still not disagreeing with you. Yes, we can use this hierarchy of holiness and it can become a leadership in many things. I suppose I'll just add this. Everybody has to learn. So, and it's trying to help and answer others. Yeah, I mean, I was really wet behind the ears when I was trying to do these things. I'll never forget, I'm not betraying any secrets of confessional here, but it was in confessional, and it was after this lady confessed, and I talked about, it was the Feast of the Holy Family, so I talked a little bit about the Holy Family, and she listened to me. This was in Italy, so she was talking in Italian, and she was saying, "Si, padre," "Yes, Father," "Si, padre," "Si, padre." And then I came to the end, and she says, "Ah, figlio mio, ah, my little child." You know, boy, yeah, boy, did that put me in my place. But do you understand, these were important lessons. That's how I grew, that's how I learned from getting some of that kind of feedback.
Jeff, related to what Benedicta is saying there, would you care to give a little potted summary of where you see the Catholic priesthood going in view of what you've just been saying?
I'd really have to say I did not bring my crystal ball with me this morning. And short of that, I'm not at all sure. Plus, in the very next chapter, we'll talk about the knowledge that Jesus had. And one of the questions that has to come up out of that is, Did Jesus ordain priests at the Last Supper? And did he ordain bishops at the Last Supper? The churches claim yes. I think we have to to look at that. Doesn't mean we can't have priesthood. But did it come from the choice of Jesus, or not choice, did Jesus impose it on the church? This is the way it shall be forever. Or was it a decision of the church itself? Let's have priests. The Jews have priests, this group have priests, let's have priests. Was that, and could that, that's, people are constantly asking me about, say, the ordination of women. And I think there's two questions that have to be answered before you can even begin to answer that one. One is this one: where does priesthood come from, and what is it? Is it something that it's always been given as part of the argument why women can't be ordained, isn't it? That Jesus ordained only men at the Last Supper. Well, that's my first query. Did he? Or does priesthood come from another source? The second one would be who makes the decision, and that concerns all the power structures within the church.
It seems to me a crucial issue, Geoff, in the light of your book, where you're talking about power, and a lot of, as Ed Campion mentioned in his presentation here when he launched the book, it really comes back to that issue, practically speaking. It seems to me that if the focus is church, which practically means a cultural, historical, structural, institutional reality, you get a very different mode of thinking and a very different outcome than if the focus is the kingdom, which is about relationships and about people. Now, when I think of the possibilities of priesthood in the context of focusing on kingdom, you must have institution. I don't have any argument with that, and you must have priesthood. But I think you end up with a different vision if you focus on kingdom than if you focus on church. And I know you've made an observation historically about Constantine and the whole change there that began in the 4th and the 5th century. Would you care to just develop that? My basic point is we think differently if we focus on kingdom than if we focus on church.
I have no difficulty with that concept. That's why that chapter's there, to turn our attention away simply from structure, church, and all the talk that goes with it. What one writer I quoted refers to as churchianity. So it's not Christianity. In other words, it's not centered on the person of Christ. It's centered on the structure and the institution of the church. And I said that that's all wrong. The church must be reaching out to the world, because all three terms, the eternal plan, the sharing, the communion, the fellowship, and the reign of God, all refer equally to the entire world. And the church is at the service of that world. So if we put that first, which Jesus put first, so this is hardly radical, if we put the kingdom or the reign of God first, then we rethink many, many things, rather than if we're putting church first. Yes, so I've no problem with that. And as I mentioned a bit earlier, almost from the time of Constantine, certainly from the time of Charlemagne, the church spent much of its energy on that external society, Christian society, ruled by the Pope and everybody following Christian values in theory. Didn't work that way, and it's disappeared, it's gone, but I think the mindset has not yet made the change.
The next chapter is one, let's stop with it a little while. It's a chapter in which I argue that Jesus was God, fully divine, and was a human being, fully human. And I've argued we've had a lot of difficulties believing that over the centuries. So there have been heresies which saw Jesus as divine but not really human. There have been other heresies which saw him as human but not divine. And putting the two together, we've had a lot of difficulties with that. I understand Father Michael just told me, someone had a question, had a problem. Does this mean that God died on the cross? Well, really, yes. Didn't mean God ceased to exist, but Jesus was God. And Jesus certainly died on the cross. Now, we've had a lot of difficulties with putting the two together, and we've had a lot of difficulties in understanding what it meant that Jesus was human. And I've argued in this chapter that there were certain privileges that the Son of God gave up in becoming a human being. The first and most obvious one, God could suffer. Jesus certainly could suffer. His suffering was real. It was not pretend. The Gospels tell us he was tempted. But if you have divine knowledge, how can you be tempted? I mean, you know it all already. Jesus had a sense of humour. There are some stories in the Gospel that are meant to be humorous stories. We had one for our Sunday Gospel about 2 weeks ago, the story of the unjust steward. It's not a parable, it's a humorous story. The problem, by the time I explain it to you, it's no longer funny. Because, and I'm reduced to saying, but you should have heard Jesus say it. It is based on things that were well known at his time, but are not today. The steward was a very powerful figure. The Hebrew word is shaliach. And the shaliach had a real power, so that if he signed a contract, the master was bound by the contract, couldn't get out of it. You know, that was the power of the shaliach. And secondly, interest was forbidden by the law of Moses. It was called usury, and it was forbidden. But it was a little bit like income tax today. People had found a whole lot of ways around the law, you know, like our bottom of the harbour and income tax schemes, etc., etc. They'd found all sorts of ways around it. And what happens is, because the shaliach had such power, if he was dishonest, he was sacked, and he would never get another job again. You know, the job depended on total integrity and honesty, and this person had been shown not to have it. So he was to be sacked. So what did he do? Called in his master's creditors and forgave the interest, right? Take your bill and sit down and write this lesser figure, forgetting the interest. In other words, ostensibly he obeyed the law of Moses, and the master couldn't change it. There's no way he could get his money back. So all he could really do, commentators would say, was pretend it was his own idea in the first place, that he was really see the humour in it? I mean, sorry, it takes so much to get there, but so it was a humorous story. Now, why did Jesus tell humorous stories? Because the same reason we do. You know, tell a joke, it settles an audience, it gets them in the right frame of mind, and then you can give your message. And that's what happens here. He tells this story, the people would have understood immediately what was happening, they would have laughed, and then he can say, you can't, you know, why can't you, in seeking the good, show something of the energy and the intelligence that people put into earning money? And we could look at people today, people who, you know, get up at 5 a.m. and go to bed at 11 at night and work for money all day. And Jesus could say to us, hey, can you have some of this energy in you know, chasing really worthwhile things and doing good? So, sorry, that was a bit of a digression, but Jesus had a sense of humour. Also, by the way, if he was God, if he had divine knowledge, then how could he have a sense of humour? Because whatever the joke, he'd have heard it before. Then he felt, you know, they say the story of the leper, that Jesus felt a real compassion. And in many circumstances, he cried. He could do all of those things. And this too argues for this fully human person. And then the last one, the fifth one, is that did he, in becoming human being, did he give up the privilege of divine knowledge? Now, this is an open question. I can't give you a definite answer to it. Pope John Paul II, in one of his more important writings, called it the frontier zone of Christology today. So, you know, the edge where we're up to. We don't have a certain answer to it. And I believe that from the evidence, we can't draw an absolute conclusion. We can't say straight out Jesus had divine knowledge. The three Gospels of Matthew, Mark and Luke would indicate that he did not. You know, you've got phrases like Jesus grew in wisdom and understanding. Well, if he had divine knowledge, how did he grow? He knew it all already. You know, he knew everything. So how would the growing taking place? So they do imply, Mark has, no one knows the time of the end of the world, not even the Son of Man, not even me. Well, if he didn't know the time of the end, how can we say he had divine knowledge? John's Gospel, on the other hand, presumes divine knowledge of all times. See what I mean? Conflicting, confusing. So we can't have absolute answers here. And after all, we're talking about what went on inside the mind of Jesus Christ. You know, that's surely, if there's something we don't know, it has to be that. You know, the most unique human being there's ever been, and we just don't have immediate answers to that. Then I quoted there was that document that came out from the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, condemning the writings of Father Jon Sobrino, and it seemed to say there, well, it did say there, Jesus had divine knowledge at all times. And I found that just too going beyond the evidence. And in fact, it quoted John's Gospel and brushed aside the rest. And I don't think you can do that. So I think we have to argue we simply don't know. But that means we cannot assume divine knowledge in Jesus. Remember too, if he did not have divine knowledge, putting it together with the other things, this makes him really one of us, doesn't it? Still God. I mean, none of this at any stage denies the divinity of Jesus. For me, he was God. I have the faith in that without hesitation. He was God. But he was also fully a human being, and part of that was he gave up the privilege of divine knowledge and had to struggle through life as you and I do, which really makes him one of us. You know, and we can relate to a Jesus like that in a way we could not to someone who at all times had divine knowledge, knew all the answers. That is somehow less fully a human being. But if he did not have divine knowledge, then we cannot assume that everything he set in place has an instant divine origin. You know, popes, bishops, all this. Jesus never talked about bishops and priests. He certainly never talked about bishops. Well, he didn't. And you know, questions like the one I asked, did he ordain priests at the Last Supper? Was that what happened? We have to ask these questions.
You say he didn't ordain bishop or didn't talk about bishops. My question is, were there bishops as such in, say, Judaism or somewhere that would have meant that that concept was familiar to the people?
Not the concept as we'd understand it today. The Greek word was episkopos, which meant an overseer. So it was a more generic word. And it meant, therefore, someone who sort of had oversight of a whole community. But the concept of the three orders of bishop, priest, deacon really comes from a writer of about the year 100, Ignatius of Antioch. He was the one who really brought that in and made it popular, and the ideas were taken up from there. So that concept of the three orders does not come from the New Testament.
Just further to the other lady's question, so there were priests, obviously, in the Jewish religion, high priests and all that.
Certainly the term used was chief priests or high priests in the Jewish religion. The term bishop or episkopos was not used in the religious sense there, and they had no equivalent of what we today call deacons. They certainly had priests. But the question remains, did Jesus ordain priests, or did the early church say, let's have priesthood, you know, borrowing it from the Jewish religion. Let's have people specially dedicated to God who represent us. And you know, the relationship between ourselves and God, will offer prayers on our behalf, will speak to us on behalf of the God. Is that something Jesus did, or did the early church say, let's do that, and then at a slightly later stage, say, let's have three categories of these, a bishop, a priest, and a deacon, around the year 100? So that brings us on to a much longer and bigger chapter, in which we look at the origins of authority within the church. And I start there by, going back to the scriptures, and I point out first of all that sometimes it was ambivalent, and that becomes important a little bit later, when it talks, say, about the establishment of Saul as the first king in Israel. And it's remarkable how often in the Old Testament you find two stories of something. We have two stories of creation, we have two stories of the flood, we have two stories of various things, and certainly we have two stories of the appointment of Saul. And one of them's in favour of having a king, and the other's against having a king. The compilers of the Bible decided to put both stories in, because both said something. The nation needed a king. It needed a government, and the only kind of government in those days was a king. So it needed a king for the ordinary administration of the country. But at the same time, the king could get in the way of God and take over, and the kings did do exactly that. So it was ambivalent, and the Bible's way of expressing that is by having the two stories. And that becomes important when we come to the story of Peter. But then I look at what Jesus did. He had these followers. He made sure, particularly in Mark's Gospel, that they were with him from the very beginning. So that the appointment of the first four is the very first scene, after two scenes of introduction. Once the story starts, the very first one is the appointment of the first four disciples. Why? Because it meant they were there from the beginning. They saw everything that happened. They heard every word that was said. So their witness was complete. And that was their first job, to be eyewitnesses, to go out and tell the story. But it raises the question, what happens when the eyewitnesses die? Did Jesus make provisions for that? Well, this is where I believe we can't draw really certain conclusions. Yes, Peter was the leader of the 12. There's no doubt at all about that. It comes through again and again. There are several occasions, again, well, in all Gospels, but let me refer particularly to Mark, where Peter speaks for the 12 in a way that no one else does. And that his word is that when Peter says, you are the Messiah, that's the group. He's speaking for the group. It's a personal faith, but it's also the faith of the 12. And he can say that in a way that no one else can. Now, did Jesus appoint Peter to that job, or did it arise naturally? You deal with 12 people over a period of time, and you'll find the natural leaders within the group. Someone will somehow emerge, and the others will accept that person. Is that what happened, or did Jesus appoint? No idea. The Gospels don't tell us the answer. It really doesn't matter. Certainly, Jesus either appointed him or accepted his natural leadership, so that he became the leader. But what about when they, after Jesus left them, they went out and began spreading the news of the story that they'd heard? They were not nearly as famous as we might believe. Many of them, we don't know their story. We don't know where they went or what happened to them. One of them is quite extraordinary, Bartholomew, because the word Bar means son of. So Simon Bar Yona, Simon son of John. Bartholomew means son of Ptolemy. Now, he would have also had a name of his own, but we know so little about him we don't even know his name. So this is the son of Ptolemy, and this is the best the writers could do. It's like referring to you as the son of Mr. Smith or something. And you could say, "You're just a minute, I've got a name of my own, I have something in my own right." Well, yeah, but we know so little. So they weren't nearly as famous, but they had this crucial job. They went out and began to teach. Began to bear witness to what they had seen and what they had heard. But what happens after that? Do we have proof that Jesus said, "When you die, you must appoint others to your role"? Or is this something that just, it happened? Naturally it happened, because the job of bearing witness didn't end when these 12 were put to death. Well, I believe the answer is we don't have certainty on these questions. We don't quite know what Jesus said. Did he say anything about that, or did he leave the group to make their own decisions as they would have to, and to hand these things on? So in other words, what I'm saying, it's hard to claim papacy, bishops have a divine origin such that it could never be looked at again. I'm not suggesting we do away with popes or bishops. That's not what this is about. I'm saying, what's the origin of it? Too many claims have been made that because Jesus did it, therefore it's set forever. And I'm suggesting that no, we, the church, have the power to adapt things to suit different circumstances, different times. Concerning the powers that were given to Peter and to the church, everyone's familiar with the quote from chapter 16 of Matthew's Gospels, "You are Peter, on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will never prevail against it, and I give you the keys of the kingdom, and what you bind on earth and bind on," etc., etc. Now, they're important words. They come from the Gospels. We must take them seriously. But I've suggested that there are three things that we must balance on the other side. A little bit of the two stories again. Firstly, that Jesus gave the name of Peter, which means the rock. And I've thought about that. It's a strange name to give to someone, because rocks don't do anything. They simply are. They're a sound foundation, but very passive image. Now, it's not the only image he gave. He also called him the keeper of the keys. "I give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven." Well, fine. That's a more active role. And yet, the office of being the rock is more foundational, because it's the one that gave Peter his name. He was called Peter, rock. He was not called Peter, or the Klavijer, the keeper of the keys. Rock was the foundational one. And that to me is the key role that Peter and any successor to Peter should hold. And to come back to the very origins of this book again, it's been my contention, I'd argue it, that when the real crisis of sexual abuse blew up in our faces, sadly, and I'm to get no joy of saying this, I believe the Pope of the time did not fulfill the role of rock. He did not hold the church together. He was silent on the issue. When it cried out for the Pope, the rock, to hold the whole church together. And as a result, I've claimed, say among the bishops and religious leaders here in Australia, some responded wonderfully well. I'm full of admiration for some of them. Some responded very badly, and the others were in between. And I believe that happened because the leadership did not come from where I would have looked for it. The rock that is meant to hold the church together. As I say, I get no pleasure in that, but I mean, that's my assessment of what happened. The rock did not hold the church together when it needed to be held together. And so our response was so all over the place, so good and bad and in between. And that was not a good thing. Yes, the first role of a pope is to be the rock. Not even sometimes even having to do very much, just be there. But sometimes having to act, to hold the very church together. So that's the first reservation. The second is that if you flip over a couple of pages of Matthew's Gospel and come to chapter 18, verse 18, you find where Jesus used the identical words almost in speaking to the disciples and saying to them, whatever you bound on earth shall be bound in heaven, whatever you... And we've got to take those words with the same seriousness as the ones concerning Peter. So in other words, I'm suggesting it's wrong to take the words to Peter, you know, you have the keys of the kingdom of what you bind on earth shall be bound, and ignore the ones in which Jesus said the same thing to the disciples. So we have to place the two together. Somehow, the power to bind and loose belonged to Peter and belonged also to the disciples. And the truth has to come in putting the two together. The third point I make is the words that immediately, for this is where the two stories come side by side. In the first story, Peter's put in a position of honor. He's told he's the rock of the church and that, he's the center of everything. A couple of verses later, it's far closer than it is concerning Saul in the Old Testament. You get Peter saying, never, Lord, never this happened to you, and Jesus responding, get behind me, Satan. And then three things happen. Instead of being in the position of honor in front of everybody, Peter's told to get behind everybody. So it's the last position. And then the first one he's told he's the rock. Now he's told he's the rock that will cause people to trip over, the stumbling block. And in the third case, in the first case he's told, your words recognizing me as Messiah come from God. Now he's told that your words telling me this can never happen to me come from Satan. So three things are suddenly contradicted in two stories put together. And I've suggested that the response, the conclusion we should draw is that, yes, we need a pope. We need a leader in that sense. We need a rock to hold us together. But that rock will be a human being. And so sometimes it will do wonderful things, sometimes no. It'll be a human, just as the story of the kings was good and bad, so the story of popes will be good and bad. And if you go through church history, how true that is. A lot of it there. Then I trace something, a real Cook's tour of church history. 2,000 years in 10 pages. Wow. Through something of the papacy, I realize it's a Cook's tour. But it's just to give you some idea of how things changed and developed and how, that concept of the Christian society was there for a best part of 1,000 years. Some of the things that led to the fights between emperor and pope and what they led to, and the way it all developed. Something of that. Then I talk of the history coming through from the time of the French Revolution and the last 2 centuries, and how the papacy went into its shell in reacting against the French Revolution, against the Enlightenment that came just before it, and saw the world as a hostile place. And so much of this has come down to us. And so that at that time, infallibility was proclaimed. It was almost the creating of a spiritual empire when a temporal one had been taken away. I've mentioned how technology came in to give a power to the Pope that the papacy had never had before. And I quoted an example where, back in the 19th century, it took 2 years for the Australian bishops to get a reply from Rome because it all had to go by sailing ship. And then in our own day, where a bishop did something that others didn't approve of, and within 2 days, he had a fax on his desk telling him to stop. Now that's an extraordinary increase in power. The Pope can run every parish in Papua New Guinea and in Africa and South America today in a way that no Pope in history could hope to do before. As late as 1939, when Pope Pius XII was elected, some of the cardinals didn't arrive in time for the conclave because they were coming by boat and didn't get there. So they missed it. Now, these things we just take for granted. Technology led to an immense rise in papal power. I comment that it could have been used to consult the church, but I'd have to say that didn't happen. It was used to control. Then I talk about the Second Vatican Council, the greatest, calm down, one of the greatest events. I almost said the greatest event in the history of the church, no. But one of the truly great events, when, one of the first time in 200 years virtually, the church had really looked at itself And it did do wonderful things. But it's also, and you must realise this, it's full of compromises, where they didn't find the answer. They knew they had to move away from where they were, but they didn't find a clear place to come to. And so you've got compromises. I quote one. It talks about the sensus fidelium, that instinct for the truth that all Christian people possess. And it talks about, in glowing terms, it says, this sense of the faithful is infallible in discerning. That is, it claims you have infallibility when all the Christian faithful throughout the world agree on something. Well, you're getting, once they agree, the whole Christian world agrees on anything. The time of day, you'd have to say it's something special. But when it has that, but then it promptly adds in the next paragraph or two, but in coming to this, it must listen to the Pope and the bishops. So you give with one hand, you take away. Now, it's full of compromises. But despite that, it did a great deal. There's unfinished business, and we now have the task of reconciling those conflicting statements, putting them together, and trying to see where we're going. It also, I'm quoting an Australian theologian here, Orman Rush, it did a lot of what he called discontinuity for the sake of continuity. In other words, to be truly in continuity with the great tradition, we had to change some things and go back to older ones at times. And so we had to go back behind some of the static concepts of the church as a perfect society, which was big, even was big when I was taught in the 1950s. Back to older concepts of a people of God on the march. There were a whole lot of things which it really was a giant step forward. But as you're aware, in the years since the Vatican Council, some things have got lost, have been downplayed. One side of where you had the two sides, one side's been taken up and the other not. For example, that one we talked about, this instinct for the truth of all the Christian faithful, where is that today? And where are the structures that might make it a reality? At the universal level, at the diocesan level, or at the parish level? And one would have to claim that many of them are not. It talked about the bishops as co-holders of supreme power within the church. In practice, it hasn't worked that way. I said that in 20 years as a working bishop, I was rarely asked my opinion on anything and never asked to vote. We were not asked to vote when it was claimed that the church teaching on the ordination of women was infallible. Now, if the bishops are not asked their opinion even when the word infallible is used, then how come you call bishops co-holders of supreme power? You see what I mean? So there was a lot of that, and I felt that there were steps backwards. I'm even so bold as to talk about 5 vicious circles that can arise out of that. And then I've talked to the role, something of the role of bishops and what it is and isn't, and I've talked to something of the Roman Curia and what it is and isn't. And I think that's been, people expected after the Declaration of Infallibility in 1870 that there would be loads of infallible statements, and it did not happen. There's only been the one, 1950, the Assumption, and no other. But what happened was that gradual rise in the certainty of all papal statements. And so I've quoted, for example, you have the Catechism of the Catholic Church, and you have all sorts of statements in that, and no indication of which ones are infallible, which ones are definitive but not infallible, whatever that means, and which ones are you're free to have different opinions on. And as you well know, there are people using that catechism as the yardstick of all orthodoxy. And it was never really, even this present Pope has said it was not meant to be that. But that's the way people are using it. And there's that danger of that creeping infallibility. There's also the danger of gradual infallibility where it's claimed if a thing's said often enough, it becomes infallible, it becomes certain teaching of a Pope. But that too is a very dangerous concept because there were certain things that were said for century after century after century. And I hope we don't, well, the Church has abandoned them now. So these were directions that have been part of the last 40 years and that I think are not moves in the right direction. I'm anticipating the second last chapter now when I say I have a lot of problems with the word democracy, particularly as you apply it to the church. See, I do not want to bring in a whole host of things that we take for granted in democracy. For example, the Diocese of Port Pirie at this moment needs a new bishop. So democracy, what do? Have priests stand up, vote for me, and wage expensive campaigns. If you elect me, I'll do this and that and the other. We don't want that, do we? We don't want campaigns like that.
What consensus today?
Yeah, so we need, but I'm saying I have big reservations about the word democracy. Also, how democratic are we? There are decisions made by, the bosses of industry and commerce and proprietors of media outlets, etc. They have immense influence, and we get no vote at all on what they do. So I prefer to avoid the word because it's got so many sidetracks on it, and instead talk about the phrase I use is participatory government. Well, there's nothing to stop it happening right now, by the way. We wouldn't have to change anything in the fundamental teaching concerning the church. Even with all the papal power you've got right now, there's nothing to stop the Pope from consulting the bishops. There's nothing to stop the Pope from consulting the people of the church. I mean, that could happen tomorrow on any question.
I'd like to go back to earlier in your lecture when you talked about the sources of our belief, the Bible and the world around us. How do we use the world around us as a source? When it seems to be so negative, don't we need a vast amount of wisdom to be able to make that a source of our religion, looking at the world around us?
The amount of wisdom to use the Bible, we need a vast amount of wisdom to use the world around us. But say, relating that to what we're talking about just now, there's been, I did a course once in leadership, it's a very common thing now. And among the things they'll tell you is how a society works, the mood, the manners, how to manage change, things like that. Well, now these are things we've learned from the world around us, and a church ignores them at its peril. Another one is the wisdom of the world, all over and over a long period of time, that all power needs checks and balances. So you have an opposition in Parliament, which is a check and balance to the Prime Minister. You have, commercial powers have checks and balances with boards, etc. Husband and wife are supposed to be a check and balance on the power of the other so that it doesn't get out of... And the whole sexual abuse thing tells us we must have checks and balances on the spiritual power exercised by priests. So yes, we need those. That's something we've learned from the world around us. All I'm suggesting is the church in its structures needs to look at that source too. So by all means study the Bible, what Jesus did, etc. But look at realities, plain simple realities that power, Lord Acton, all power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely. This is the wisdom of the world, but we ignore it at our peril. So I'm suggesting that therefore we look at the wisdom of checks and balances within the church.
So you mentioned the Pope not saying sorry. Was he advised to do this, do you think, or was this his culture from where he came from?
He's not the only person who has a problem with the word sorry, as you would be aware. Someone closer to home seems to too. I don't know. I mean, that's my problem. Pope John Paul II, look, a great man and a holy man, all those things. But he never, to my knowledge, addressed himself directly to victims. Never said a word straight to them. He didn't say to the whole church, this is a terrible scandal, we must answer it with all the compassion of Jesus Christ, and let's put victims before the good name of the church. There are no words along those. He was silent most of the time. And I was working, I was at the forefront of this in this country. I was the one fronting victims daily and fronting the media, and it would have been so helpful to have been able to quote a pope, and I couldn't. And I felt, way out there in front and in a battle, as it were, and the army left behind. And that was a very lonely place. I do believe the Pope is so powerful in so many things. Had there been that kind of leadership, our response would have been far better. The next chapter then is the one entitled Free and Responsible, about our moral journey. And if you've read it, you may know that I start there by talking of something of the journey of the people of Israel. And I've picked out what I see as 6 steps on their journey, beginning very bottom with the idea of vengeance, 77-fold vengeance for Lamech, rising up to the 5th level of getting even, then to the 4th level of self-interest, the 3rd level then of respecting rights, the 10 Commandments, the 2nd level of loving my neighbour as I love myself, and then the very top level of loving as God loves. Now, if you study the Bible, you may come up with a few more steps. There's nothing solemn or magical about those 6. There's 6 I've picked out. But they do talk about the story of a journey that we find through the Bible. And it's a story that I'm part of too, because I can fall back to that 6th level at any time whatsoever, in a split second. Someone says something to me that really angers me, and bang, I want to get back at that person. We're all capable of that, but we're also capable of the top level. Then, in the rest of the chapter, I talk about conscience. Now, there are 2 extremes that you're always hearing. One extreme is, do what the church tells you to do, don't think, just do it. The other extreme is, do what you like. Now, I want to make it very emphatic, I am not proposing either of those extremes in this book. I need to say that because sometimes if you hint anything less than do what you're told, you're instantly accused of favouring do what you like. And that is emphatically not true of what I'm trying to say here. I talk about doing right things, but I say there's more to morality than that. It's about growth. And to grow, I need to do 2 things. I need to do right things. I don't grow by doing wrong things. But I also need to take responsibility for what I do. Unless I do that, I will not grow. If the only reason I do things in my life is because that's what the church tells me to do, then I won't grow. I've got to take responsibility. Whatever it is, of course, ultimately I've got to. Ultimately, I'm responsible for what I do, wherever I get it from. So I need to do the 2 things, do right things and take responsibility. I'm advocating that, yes, of course we should listen to the church. We are Christians. So of course we're going to listen to Jesus Christ, we're going to listen to the scriptures. We're also members of the church, so we're going to be listening to what the church has to say to us. And I'm not advocating anything different. But finally, we must make the decision. And then I talk about in the book about what I see as the role of the church, to explain what conscience is, to how to form a conscience, to give us guidance on a lot of the issues that commonly face us, but then also to encourage us to make our decisions and to grow in the process.
Bishop, in this morning's Herald, Cardinal Pell is quoted as saying, he disputes that there has ever been a traditional Catholic Church teaching on truth and personal conscience that gives the ultimate right to Catholics to make moral judgments based on individual conscience, even if it is in error. Would you care to comment?
Please understand, in the book, Cardinal Pell does not get a mention, and it's not about him, and I'm not going to comment on him specifically now. On the issue, as I've said here, there's never been one single firm tradition on conscience. You've always had these two. I've said they're typified by Augustine and Aquinas. Augustine really favouring that idea that we, you can see his point. Who's more likely to be right? One single individual or an entire community? And the answer's got to be, in most cases, the community's more likely to be right than the individual. So he says, follow the community, forget your own thoughts. But Aquinas, on the other hand, was saying, you've got to take responsibility. That's how we grow. Not just by doing the right things. We've got to take responsibility, so we must ultimately. Now, it is true, there's never been one single agreed teaching. The Vatican Council, I pointed out, both are there. You find one and then a page later, you've got the other. So there's this thing. To go as far as that quote, no, I could never go that far. You know, there are a lot of, I've quoted here numbers of statements which talk about us taking responsibility, taking our decisions. It's only when you put it to the extreme that I don't care what the church says, I'll make up my mind. As I've said, I am not supporting that idea. I believe that because I'm a Christian, I must be in dialogue with Jesus Christ, the scriptures, etc. Because I'm a Catholic, I must be in dialogue with the church, and that means listening respectfully. But finally, I've got to make the decision because I alone am responsible for it. I alone must finally answer to it.
I think we double bind our people. On the one hand, we say yes to conscience. The second step is you must have an informed conscience. And the third step is this is how it shall be informed. So we give with the left hand and take with the right. Now, would you care to comment on that and maybe how we might go through it? Because I rather suspect that this whole area of conscience is a key one in breaking through to a new way of being church.
Yes, it is key. The Vatican Council itself actually did the sort of thing you're talking about in several fields. I mentioned it later. It said the sensus fidelium, this instinct for the truth of all the faithful taken together, is infallible. But in forming their conscience, they should listen to the bishops. That's this business of putting one statement here and one statement here, satisfying both sides by giving them each a statement, even though the two really can't be reconciled. Now, was that insincere on the part of the Vatican Council? No. It was as far as it could go at that time in that place, and there's still work to be done. And conscience is definitely a field on which there's still a lot of work to be done. I've suggested here, for what it's worth, the answer lies in that obligation to take responsibility for what I'm doing, because that's the only way in which we can grow. Now, if we accept that principle, it seems to me a lot of things fall into place. Of course, I must listen to the church. As I've said, so much of this debate is in terms of the two extremes. Which is right, this extreme or that extreme? And that's all you'll ever hear most of the time. No matter who it comes from, you hear one or the other. You get the sort of statement that was read out to us from the Herald today. You'll get any amount of the opposite, won't you? No, don't do that. Do your own thing. And that's where a lot of society has swung to, away from these terrible strictures of the church to an unlimited freedom. And the truth lies in the middle. So we're only going to find our way forward when somehow we can start getting people to come to that middle ground and talking about that middle ground.
Bishop, surely the final analysis of our conscience should be a study of Christ's conscience, because he's supposed to be our model. How do we study his conscience? From his actions?
The only word I quarrelled with was the word final. Yes, of course. I mean, my problem with the conscience is for how can I know exactly what Jesus thought, let alone what he would have thought about something which he never faced. He says not a single word about nuclear bombs, does he? For very obvious reasons. So how do I know whether Jesus would have approved or disapproved of stockpiling nuclear weapons with no intention of using them, but simply as a deterrent? Now, that's a complex question. And simply to think about, what Jesus would have intended is not necessarily the way I'm going to find an answer. Of course, I've got to take it into consideration. When I can know what he would have thought, when I can somehow intuit what he would have thought, then that's taking me a long way along the way. So I'm agreeing with you, yes, of course that's one of our sources, one of our greatest sources, one of the most important of all. But it's not one that gives us instant answers to all our questions.
In terms of this whole question and having to come to a final sort of a choice or coming to a decision that, as well as you can with the information you've got, would you care to comment about the spirit of the law and the letter of the law?
Well, the first thing I have to say is that the field of morality and the field of law are two really quite different fields. And I can't use always the concepts of law in any way in trying to resolve issues of conscience. Nor can I say too much of the difference between, say, what the Pope said and what I think he meant to say. I've really got to go, if I want to know what he meant, I've got to really take what he said as my first real guide into that. No, it's rather, as I've tried to say here, when a big issue of conscience, something really important comes up, I've got to think about it. And I've got to try to get to the mind of Jesus. I've got to try to listen to the church. I've got to do all those things. But having done all of that to the best of my ability and within the limits, I might have a limited time because I've got to do the action. But then, having done all that study that I can, there comes the moment when I leave that behind and when I enter this room where there are only two people, God and myself. No one else allowed, just the two of us. And I've got to stare right into God's eyes, and then I've got to make the decision. And that's the moment of conscience to me. So it's not conscience when I've got a group of people around me saying, oh, say this, say that, say the other. That very popular idea of conscience, do what you like, means I can take my ideas from all over the place and do what I want to. No, to me it's, I listen to all the best sources I've got, but then finally I'm alone with God and I'm staring straight into God's eyes where I know I can't fool God. And that will help me not to fool myself. Won't guarantee I won't, but it can help me not to fool myself. Well, this is a fascinating history, this subject. You need to go back to the Old Testament. As I've said, the only statements you'll really find there are moral statements. And you've got to try and work out from that a sort of a theology behind it. And then there are beautiful statements. There are also some pretty awful ones. This particularly was a very masculine world that produced the Bible, and you find some extremely off-putting statements about women within the Bible, part of that story. These are not the end of the story. They're very much back towards the beginning. Some of those, really put down statements. But then, overwhelmingly, in the Old Testament, you find the two ethics, the purity ethic and the property ethic. The purity ethic was all that about clean and unclean. and it was the basis of really of their whole sexual morality. It contained things that we would agree with, but it contains others that we find coming out of nowhere at us. You know, why is it all right to eat fish but not eat lobster or prawns? Why is it okay to eat animals that have a cloven hoof and not ones that don't? You know, really, it's comes out of nowhere at us, and equally with its sexual ethic. And then the property ethic was all based on, not just Israel, by the way, this is the whole of the ancient world had very little concept of the individual that would be so powerful in our society today. Society was based on the family. The family was the basic unit of society, not the individual. And the family consisted of a male head and then a wife or wives or concubines and children. And the man was the boss, the head. They were his property. And so a man could divorce his wife because an owner can get rid of property. A woman could not divorce her husband because property can't disown its owner. Equally, if a man had sexual relations with an unmarried woman, it was not adultery. If a woman was married and had sex with anybody, it was adultery because it violated the rights of her husband. Now, this goes on for those thousands of years of the Old Testament. And then along came Jesus, and he was utterly radical in these two aspects that have been so foundational of family and of relationships and sexuality. Firstly, he abolished the whole concept of the purity law, because to him it was too external, and to him goodness is very much internal, within the heart and mind. Now, he abolished all the purity laws concerning foods, but also he abolished them across the board. Now, what that meant was that he took away virtually the entire sexual morality that the Old Testament had had, and he did not replace it. He doesn't say, instead of doing that, do this. He simply abolished all of that. Similarly, he abolished the whole concept of the woman as the man's property. And particularly in that phrase in Mark's Gospel, if a man leaves his wife and marries another, he commits adultery, and in the really revolutionary words, against her. Now that was totally new, totally radical. The very idea that a man could commit adultery against his wife, that was it's hard to compare it. It was shocking to the men of the time. And it's hard to say what today would cause such, an equal shock. It really abolished the whole concept of family as it was then, the whole structure as it was then. And again, Jesus did not replace it. Now that left the church with a big dilemma. What are we going to do in these two fields? How do we organize society? How do we organize family? And what do we say about sexual morality? Well, this is where my very brave contention is that the New Testament was not very successful in either field. And so it didn't really replace the sexual morality with any other. And so you do find them in places floundering. Paul, for example, let's pick on him, by the way. It's easy to do that. Paul, bad guy when it comes to women and sex. Not quite. There's a lot more to Paul than dismissing him like that. But at one stage, he's talking about what to him was the vexed question: can women get up in the assembly and talk? And he didn't like this. This was against everything he'd ever been taught. Remember, he was a very good Jew. Tells us himself he was brought up according to a strict observance. So he really didn't like the idea of a woman addressing the community. So he gives a reason or two, this reason and that reason, and he realizes himself they're not very convincing. So he adds to that, and if anyone's still inclined to argue, let him know that this is not done in the churches. Really, it's a sort of an appeal to authority. The churches don't do it, therefore you mustn't do it. It's not an attempt at that point to say, go back to the mind of Jesus you were talking about? He really knows he can't do that. So they didn't find something to replace the sexual morality, and they didn't find really anything much to replace the property ethic. Paul at least realized that had been fatally wounded by Jesus, that it needed change. But remember, he believed that the end of the world was about to occur. Jesus would come again. What's the point in changing society upside down if the world's about to end? Pretty good argument, isn't it? It's hard to quarrel too much with it. One of the other books then, 1 Peter, was worried about persecution, a very real worry. And said, look, persecution is threatening. We must not do anything that would upset people. So let's not change this, the family upside down. So they backed away from it, and it didn't happen. Now, it's the book I've quoted here says that the church in fact looked outside to a particular Jewish philosopher, Philo of Alexandria, who was trying to justify the purity law to possible converts to the Jewish religion, and talked about that concept of what's natural and what's not natural. And he used some rather off-putting phrases. He said that having sex with a menstruating woman was like sowing seed in a swamp, and having sex with a homosexual relationship was like sowing seed in a desert. And he said neither is natural. And a whole concept of natural and unnatural grew out of that, and as everybody knows, is still with us within the Catholic Church. So, to my surprise, actually, I found that, these problems are 2,000 years old, and they come from the very radicalism of Jesus, and the fact that even the New Testament and the Church since has not found the replacements. Jesus didn't talk about family structure because he was really talking about, come follow me. Leave your family. I'm not going to go and reorganize family. Come follow me. So he doesn't talk about the restriction. That was left to the early church, and they didn't. So I've tried to look at morality today. If you've read the book, you'd know that the critique, or the great criticism I make of Catholic morality on this, is that it's all in relationship to offences against God. And I just think that it's putting words into God's mouth that were never there. I don't really think God gets terribly upset by sex in and of itself alone. God does get upset when we hurt other people, through sex or through anything else. And I've suggested that if we want a sexual morality, we go back to Jesus, and we take the principle he did give: love one another. Treat others as you would want them to treat you. And I believe that having said that, Jesus consciously thought, I've said everything about sex I need to say. What more do you need if you do that? If you genuinely love. When I say love, I don't mean being in love. That's a quite different thing. I mean love one another. So I've argued for a morality in which we avoid all the traps, the negative things of using violence, deceit, trivializing, using people, all those things, because they're not loving. But then in addition, we require that positive thing, that it needs to be genuinely wanting all that is good for the other, not just not doing harm. There's no phrase of Jesus where he said, do no harm. He said, love one another, which is going further. So once again, it's like conscience here. The danger that on one side you have people saying no sex ever, except in marriage and solely for the purpose of procreation. And then you have people on the other hand saying, do what you like. Once again, I am not advocating either extreme. Let's put that away. It's very hard to get away from that. I'm advocating something that's in the middle. And I think, the crucial thing here that dare I say it, deserves a lot of thought would be this. It's a question, not an answer. Within this context, may we ask whether a sexual act is morally right when positively It is based on a genuine love of neighbour, that is a genuine desire for all that is good for the other person, rather than self-interest, and negatively contains no damaging elements such as harm to a third person, etc. And then is the question of when these circumstances might apply, and whether and to what extent they might apply even outside marriage, one for discussion and debate by both the church community and the wider community, and for decision and responsibility before God, before other people, and before one's own deeper self by each individual. Now that's a fairly dense paragraph, if I say so myself, and so I think it would require a fair bit of thinking. It's not a simplistic answer such as don't even think about sex or do what you like. Love, to me, in this context in which I'm using it, means not even a feeling. The feeling comes, yes, and the feeling's great, but the essence of the love is wanting all that is good for the other. Now, a couple can be not in love, but still want what is good for the other. And I have no problem with their having a sexual relationship. I think we've got to keep that distinction between loving another person and being in love with another person.
Bishop Robinson, I'm sure I read it not so long ago, a very short article in the Tablet. I'm not sure it was by a priest or not, but he said something that one day we'll acknowledge that the young people of today that are coming together, and not just because they're getting married, are loving each other, we may learn something from them, in so much as that the law of marriage was put through the church in the 16th century primarily for property reasons. Can you comment on that?
Church law covers many centuries, not just the 16th. There were many laws that were there before, been up and down. Property was certainly a big consideration in some of the things that came out. And even when you read the case histories, they're all about kings and noble people, and where property came in a big way. Whether we'll learn, I mean, of course we can always learn from anybody, and yes, there are some things, but it strikes me that what we're meeting today is the phenomenon I talked about. You get an extreme, people react against it, and they go straight to an opposite extreme. And it seems to me that that's what we've got today. In fact, I happen to believe, I could be, I'd love to hear other people talk about it, but my feeling is the church dominated Western society for the best part of 1,000 years, and it still is, but now in a negative way, because people are still reacting against it and almost doing the very opposite of what the church is saying because it's the opposite of what the church is saying. And in that sense, the church is still controlling the agenda in a way it doesn't want to, but doing the opposite, actually, well, the Catholic Church in particular, but that Christian world in general, doing the opposite of that has become a very powerful force for people. And my answer, rather than saying, yes, I can learn from young people of today, but what I really want is for both sides to come somewhere towards the middle where we can learn from each other. And I fear that until we start making that move towards each other, we're not really going to learn too much from each other.
Maybe it's actually going beyond these two extremes rather than trying to find the middle, because what you seem to give here is that we are always against that our arguments have to be against the opposite argument, which I think is still a little bit childish, so that somehow we have to meet in the middle so that it's not your view or my view, and we are even. While I think the message of Christ, the way I understand it, it is well beyond these extreme, because if he doesn't talk about sex at all, because to him, as you were saying before, it's about how people care for each other, respect each other. So whether they're male, female, all young, that's irrelevant. The principle is exactly the same. And that's why the sex, as you said before, is just one of the many activities of human beings. But the dignity of any human beings, the care we have for any human beings, that is where the message is. And that is probably why he just said, look, you're fussing around about all these laws and love one another is the base one.
I'm not sure I'd make such a distinction between going beyond or coming to the middle. I think if you come to the middle, you'll go beyond either of the extremes. So I'm not fussed about that. Yes, it is going beyond. It is getting back to the radicalism of Jesus, and that challenges both sides. It challenges those who want to be all dogmatic, but it also challenges those who say, do what you like. You know, the fascinating thing about Jesus, I find, is he's the one founder of a great religion in history who said next to nothing about sex. And that's one thing in which we have not followed him. We've written vast tomes on the subject and repeat them endlessly. And yet, what do we conclude? That Jesus was naive, that he didn't know anything about sex, or he was afraid of it or something? Far from it. Surely we can conclude, he said, love one another, and he really meant it, and he showed us how to do it. And he said, if you do that, I don't need to say anything more about sex. I mean, that's really radical and very beautiful. As long as we don't instantly interpret it, good, I can do what I like, which is how, unfortunately, many people do. And I think we've still got these two extremes. And, yeah, it's when they come together that they will go beyond, if I may put it that way. And that's what we need to do.
It seems to me that one of the factors that, and incidentally, let me say, I think your few chapters there on sexuality are the clearest and most balanced I've read in years. I found it most helpful. One of the factors we need to have, however, complementing this is the reality of community. I think we learn care and respect and a sense of the dignity of the other by living, by experience of a community. That raises a very, very serious issue for me and a huge challenge, I think, because that is an area where I think modern Western culture is very, very poor. The strength of the individual is what we've emphasised, and where do you go to find community? Where do you go to find Christian community? And I think there's a huge issue there. I think it's closely related to the whole issue of sexuality. The difficulties with sexuality wouldn't arise, I don't think. We wouldn't be looking for the legalism and the hard and fast rules if we'd grown up in good communities.
Several things to comment there. Firstly, the church was into all the legalisms even when we did have a good sense of community. So that it's not quite the solution. The second is there was a whole section of the book that I ended up cutting out. It's appeared in some other things I've written elsewhere, but it's where I look at the Industrial Revolution and the way it oppressed the individual, and then came to the 1960s, which were, to me, the great rebellion against all of that. The Industrial Revolution, the Cold War, the Depression, all of those things which debase the individual and reduce the individual to a cog in a machine, part of a great big factory, and you turn nut number 42B all day. And that was who you were, nothing else. And in that society you could lose a sense of who I am, and whereas in the little village in earlier times you were known, you had some importance in that smaller world. So in the 60s we had this massive rebellion full of immense energy and basically good, because it was rebelling against real problems. But same old thing, when you get massive energy released, there's going to be bad with the good. And I saw two things that were bad about that massive revolution. The first was that it picked on the easier targets because they're always easier to attack, and so it picked on the obvious ones, mainly all the P's. Parents, politicians, priests, pedagogues, and who have I left out? Some other P. Police. You picked on all of these because they're easier to attack. And so you can talk about all the ills of politicians and all the things parents do wrong and how terrible police are. But that doesn't even touch the real problems that are deeper. Poverty, war, the machine. It doesn't get down to those. And in a sense, the very people we will most need in order to overcome those problems are the very ones we've been attacking. And I think that's been a real weakness of the last 40 years in Western society. This constant attack on the 5 Ps, and yeah, I mean, justified in, things, awful things have happened. We know that. Corruption and all the rest of it. But we end up hurting the very people we're going to need. So the causes of unease and problems are still there with us because we haven't really faced them. The second one is the one you're talking about, that because it was reacting against the way the individual had been oppressed, it exalted the individual and put the individual above community. So we live today in this quite unique period of individualism. The individual comes first before community. We've lost our sense of community. And yes, we need to regain it. Again, it's one of these going from one extreme to an opposite extreme, and we need to come back to the middle in order to go beyond. And I think there too we need to get a better balance between the individual and community. And we don't have it at the moment. We're far too much into individualism. I didn't say celibacy was a small component. I didn't use the word small. I said it's not the whole. So that if you abolish celibacy and had every priest married tomorrow, it does not necessarily follow that all abuse would disappear. Married men can abuse very well indeed, thank you. And they do. So it's not the total, as you know, people love the simplistic. And so sexual abuse by priests, celibacy. Sorry, it's not that simple. But I do believe, now I mentioned 3 cases in which I see, 3 categories in which I see it as being a very direct component. But then you may have noticed that later, when I talk about the 3 elements of an unhealthy psychology, an unhealthy ideas, and an unhealthy environment, I've said that celibacy can contribute to all 3. It can contribute to the unhealthy psychology, depression. It can contribute to the unhealthy ideas, misogyny, for example. I have met that in particularly older priests, but I'm not saying younger priests can't fall into that too. The sort of idea, if I can't marry a woman, there's something wrong with them anyway, who'd want to. Misogyny. And then there's the unhealthy environment. It can also contribute there. So celibacy, I think, is a major factor. I wouldn't ever use the word small. I'm just making the point it's not the whole cause, and it gets us off onto a sidetrack if we think that that's all it's about. I don't know that I can make any intelligent comment on whether an accent on gender differences is really causing the problems. I think someone else who knew a lot more about that would have to make the comment. Can I pick the, I've talked about Jesus saying love one another, you've repeated it. There is, of course, a terrible danger in that word, love. We use it to cover such a variety of things. And young people will, to me at times rather glibly say, oh, we love one another. But, I know you do too, we both take the word quite seriously. Jesus meant what you said he meant. To love is to want everything that's good for you. Everything, not my self-satisfaction alone, and that can be involved in it, of course. But what I want is all that's good for you. And it does not necessarily follow that having sex right here and now is going to be good. That needs a lot of thought. 1 or 2 people have tried to pin me down of saying, are you saying sex can take place outside marriage? And I have no answer to that. I don't exclude it, obviously, from what I've said. But
let me put it this way. If I were in that field, I would personally be very slow, because there are serious dangers outside marriage of whether it truly is loving the other person or it's using that person for my satisfaction. I'm not being dogmatic here, I can't be. I know that one of the great criticisms of what I've said will be it's not clear. We need a clear rule here. And yours is not. I know that's going to be a great criticism. And it's while we have to deal with this vague and yet beautiful word love, there's always going to be difficulties. You know, the gender difference is, yes, if I love a woman, I must love her as a woman, not as one of the boys. You know, I've got to respect the gender differences. There's a limited time. I can't do everything here. Perhaps just a tiny bit on the chapter the one chapter I do have on abuse. I won't mention some of the elements of healing. I mentioned forgiveness. Just to say this: when you meet a victim of abuse, don't ever try to say to them, "You must forgive," if you're a Christian. It isn't that simple. It's a lot more complex than that. And a glib forgiveness achieves very little. And it can take a person years. I've suggested that it's the two words and their origins tell us a lot. There's a first stage to forgiveness of being able to let be, to leave behind. And that can take years. You can still find yourself angry years later, and it can get you down. And you have to learn to be very, tolerant of yourself. And then there is a second stage where to forgive means to want not just punishment, to want the person to grow. And I think we have to learn those two stages of it. I won't stop there. If you want to ask questions about it later, do. I then get on to the chapter that I've called The Prison of the Past. And I make the point, yes, I think the church is in a prison. And it wasn't evil people who put it there. It built it for itself, locked itself in and threw away the key. And that this was a bad mistake. I've said that one of the rights I treasure most greatly in my life is my right to be wrong. Other rights I could give up and still survive, but I couldn't survive a single day without that one. The right to be wrong in big things and small things, the right to be able to say, sorry, I misunderstood, sorry, I was insensitive, sorry, I need to be able to do that. And it seems to me that the church has put it itself into a position where it can't do that. Now, when you talk about the big infallible things, it says, no, I can't do that. But actually that spills over into quite trivial things. We belong to a church that is not good at saying sorry. It sometimes gets round to it, but it usually takes about 500 years. And it's not good at saying sorry. And I think this is the reason. It's put itself into a prison of the past. So I've argued for two things. Firstly, that we should abandon the concept of the infallible and replace it with the concept of truths that are essential to the identity of the church. There are such truths. I quote the very obvious one. There once was a person called Jesus who walked this earth. If you don't believe that, you're hardly a Christian. That would seem pretty essential to the very identity of the church. And we could add, numerous others. If you don't believe in God, if you're an atheist, not an agnostic, but an atheist, then I find it very hard to say you are really a member of a Christian church. An agnostic, yes, that's sort of halfway, and that's a state of still trying to work through it. But an atheist, no, certainly there are truths that are essential to the identity of the church. But I think we've gone too far, and we've added all sorts of others that really are not essential to the identity. And the one I quote simply because it's an obvious one, is the Assumption of Mary. Now, if Jesus did not return to his Father at the end of his life, then essential things are missing. But if Mary wasn't assumed body and soul into heaven, it seems to me the Christian church remains pretty much as it was. So why make such an obligation out of it? And I've quoted the fact, if you as a Catholic believe everything the church says, everything, except the Assumption, you're a heretic. Right, if you deny that one, because it's been solemnly and infallibly defined. So if you deny that, you're putting yourself outside the Catholic Church. And I'm saying, why? I mean, as I said, if you ask me, do I believe in the Assumption? And my answer actually is yes. But if you ask me why, I'd have to answer, the honest answer would be, that's what my mother told me when I was a little child. I accepted it from her and I've never changed it. It's still there. Can I prove it? No. But do I believe it? Yes. Yes, I do. It's not the most important truth in my hierarchy, but I don't believe it should have been made an infallible dogma. I don't believe that weight should have been put on it. I think that should be reserved to those things which are essential to the very identity of the church. And then I've queried the concept of the infallible, and if you've read the book, you'll know I've gone through some of the history there, quoted St. Augustine, Gregory the Great, the Orthodox churches. I've then gone into a bit of the First Vatican Council and that document Pastor Aetonus, which proclaimed infallibility. And I found it, I have to say, to be much weaker than I expected it would be. It quotes councils, and it's misquoting them. The first two particularly, it talks about the Eastern and Western churches in love and harmony. Well, come on, they were fighting one another and calling one another every possible name under the book. And I just found it, I've used the word disingenuous to quote them in that fashion. And then I've quoted a number of issues which really raise the question of infallibility. For example, that of original sin, and those statements which talk about Adam and Eve as though it was a real story, and which even go so far as to say death did not exist in this world before original sin. And I find that one now rather hard to take. And I then quote various other issues as well. So I do all of this, by the way, through questions. Now why? Is it because I'm pusillanimous, as I've been accused of being? Well, maybe. But I don't want to set one lot of dogmatic statements up against another lot of dogmatic statements. I don't think that's the way forward. I want to start a conversation. And the way to do that, I believe, is by asking questions. So in all the crucial areas of this book, that's what I do. And if someone sees that as weak on my part, so be it. But I want to get the conversation going. And so that's what I've done here. But I do ask the questions about whether we should replace infallibility with statements which are essential to the identity of the church, and only those, no others. And then whether it is possible to have the concept of infallible teaching within the church, or whether that just ends up putting us in the prison of the past. There were people who opposed infallibility back in the middle of the 19th century. It was a particular era. I'll try to bring out a little bit of that in the book. You go back actually to the period of the Enlightenment in the 18th century and the French Revolution. And it has to be said the church responded badly to those during the 19th century and got itself into a, Pope Pius VII, who was the Pope at the time of Napoleon, the one who was imprisoned, actually welcomed the French Revolution. Before he became Pope, he had a note paper, and at the top of it, he had as almost a motto, fraternity, equality, the French Revolution. He'd taken those concepts. But then when he was imprisoned by Napoleon, caused the church to react against it, and you had particularly Gregory the 16th, who became a most reactionary pope, wrote a sweeping encyclical condemning everything in sight, and even condemned trains, by the way. They were a recent invention, and he made a play on words in French and said, les chemins de fer sont chemins d'enfer. Literally, the paths of steel are paths of hell, would be the literal translation. It's a play on words in French. And then Pius IX, who, by the way, started out as the most liberal pope. He was a very personable person, and he was as popular in the 19th century as John the 23rd was in the late 1950s and 60s, at the time of the council. He started out that way, but then he went into a shell and he changed, and he put out this famous syllabus of errors, 80 errors to be condemned, and one of them was that the popes cannot have anything to do with modern, the modern world. The church did react against it and got into a... Now, infallibility came out of that world, and there were opponents of it, there's no doubt about that. And Pius IX ultimately, he started off by saying he was leading to the council, he wasn't going to, interfere, but oh, he did. Once he saw that the opposition was there, he really did. And, this is only a reported one, because obviously it was a report of a conversation, but one of the opponents, there was a group of them there, and one of them, speaking in French, said to the Pope that something about, but Holy Father, the Church, and he interrupted and said, Je suis l'Église, I am the Church. It came out of that history, and I think I've tried to do a little of that, I've set it in its history, and I've asked whether now is a time that we really need to look at it again. Interestingly, yes, in the encyclical Ordinum Sint, which is the one on Christian unity, Pope John Paul did ask leaders of other Christian churches to suggest ways in which the papacy could be re-looked at. I'm not sure that a Catholic bishop is going to be equally welcome in making comments about how it should be organised. But he did ask that of others. And Pope Benedict, our present Pope, did make a statement too about going back to the way the papacy was envisaged in the first millennium, and that, say, if Orthodox and Catholics were to be reunited, something that's, I forget the exact words, sorry, I don't want to put them in his mouth, but concepts that came from there could be acceptable.
Just backtracking, if you don't mind, Bishop, could you comment on the fact that children who are sexually abused, for the most part, seem not to tell their parents?
They're a bit more likely to today, a bit more, but by and large still they won't, because it's very, very, very confusing. And see, if it's within the family, how do you tell your mother that your father's abusing you? You sense that this is going to be so disruptive. If it's a priest, the attitude is you won't be believed. Now, for years and years that was true. There's no doubt about it. There was, you wouldn't be believed. I mean, I've heard horrendous cases of that, of people who did say something and got a smack over the ears for it. How can you say such terrible things, you wicked child? So they wouldn't have been believed. That is what has changed. Now a child, if they told their parents they'd been abused by a priest, they are far, far more likely to be believed. And that's why they're more likely to speak up. Abused people need to know they will be believed. This is the problem to me within the church in many countries today. They still haven't set up something which would really listen to victims. So that if a victim wants to be heard in those countries, they would really have to come forward to a priest or something and say, and get the third degree. And they're not going to do that. So those countries, some of which deny the existence of abuse in their country, will never know whether it exists unless and until they set up something like where sympathetic people
not gullible people, but sympathetic people. I've sat there for 2 hours and listened to a whole story of a woman, and a couple of months later it all came out it was a total fabrication. So I know that can happen. But I also know that 9 times out of 10 at least it is a true story. So you must come willing to listen. And until you do that, you're not going to get the stories. And people are not going to come forward. Or if they do, they'll go to the police or somebody. They won't come near the church.
Jeff, going back to the question of infallibility, being a lawyer, I remember my Chief Justice saying, well, when all else fails, let's look at the Act. So I went back to the book on Vatican I, and there are a number of statements of the doctrine that came before that council. The first of them looked like what most Catholics would agree is what they believe. It's what the bishops immediately threw out and said, go and redraft it again. They came back with a second version, and that was thrown out. The actual decree that was passed, if you look at it carefully, seems to me to be a lawyer's compromise, because it said in such and such circumstances the Church, the Pope, is invested with that infallibility with which Christ wished to endow his Church. And before they got round to answering that question, Napoleon appeared and they all went home. And Vatican II sedulously avoided making any statement about with what infallibility did Christ invest his Church. So it's still an open question. We may be able to scrabble around and get the key back.
Wish you luck. I spent a lot of time on that particular phrase. Yes, Vatican I does not simply say the Pope's infallible. It says he possesses that infallibility which Christ wished his Church to have. So directly it's saying that the Church possesses that infallibility. But then it promptly goes on to say, but however, it's the Pope alone who can exercise it, and, you know, anathema to those who appeal from the Pope to the Church, as though it were something different. But yes, it is a careful form of words. But yet that business of giving a bit to both sides is present even there. But then there was, you know, that's something we must also take account of. At the time it was proclaimed, in 1970, papal infallibility was very, very popular across a lot of people. And hence that great euphoria that grew up, and it was that euphoria as much as anything that led to a lot of the bad effects that followed from it. You know, the concept of a pope somehow above the church, replacing the concept of the diagram of a pope at the centre of a circle with a pyramid with the pope at the top. That came as much out of the euphoria surrounding it as it did out of the document itself. Yes, well, you take it from this. The old code, when it talked about the church, the 1917 code, said, let's start at the top. Chapter 1, the Pope. You know, without any preliminaries, just in describing the church, the Pope. And then down it went, and the laity were at the very bottom, obviously. Where else would they be? In that view of church. And yeah, even the canons that dealt with them were pretty weird. Won't go into that. When the new code was mooted, then we'd had the Vatican Council. And the first draft was still the old one, the Pope downwards. But then it changed, and that was, dare I say it, one of my great... I was involved in that with a big international meeting we had, succeeding in each... And it was changed to the people of God instead of... But that's going back to the Second Vatican Council. When it comes to the church, chapter 1 is no longer the Pope, it's the mystery of the church, which is a wonderful place to start. In other words, the church is God's work, finally. Mystery, and there's, you know, many things. God's the means of God's presence, the form of it. We don't understand. This is the mystery. God within each of us. So the mystery of the church. Having devoted a whole chapter to that. Chapter 2, the people of God. That's what the church is. It is the people of God. Then chapter 3, and only then, we start talking about the hierarchy of the church. And the code took up those concepts, and fortunately, its force was that it gave practical effect. And it also served a lot to make the council intelligible. I remember when I was talking about the new code, one of the surprises I got was in talking to groups of priests, and some of the elder priests said, this is for the first time I can understand what that council was trying to say. This was, by the way, 20 years after the council, that it hadn't got through until it came down to the code and was put in fairly simple statements, and then they did get that concept of what the church's first mystery, then the people of God, and then, and only then, it has a hierarchy. And we've got, we can do a lot of building on those concepts. It's going to take at least another 100 years before someone can write a balanced judgment on the Second Vatican Council. We're too close to it. In some things it was evolutionary. In some things it was revolutionary. In other things it's full of compromise. And that has to be said. It's all three. It's all of those together. It is still, to me, one of the greatest events that's ever taken place within the Catholic Church in 2,000 years. In what it did. One of its problems was that it had to catch up with 200 years of not looking at anything. And that's one of the massive problems that it ran into. I've indicated in the book that it's still unfinished business. There's still a whole lot that needs to be resolved, and we have to move forward, your concept. We're not going to find a way of compromise halfway between some of the things. We've got to come up with something new. A new synthesis on a whole lot of questions. For example, just to mention the two I've got in the book, I mentioned on the conscience of conscience. It's not a matter of deciding simply between Augustine and Thomas Aquinas. We've got to bring in that element of taking responsibility. And only when we do that do we suddenly begin to find the compromise. The way ahead. And that is, yes, in your terms, it is not finding just the middle. It's going beyond both of them and moving ahead. Equally with the concept of the sensus fidelium, that instinct for the truth and the faith that all Christian people collectively possess, and where I indicated the Council has one statement saying it's infallible, and then a couple of pages later another one saying, but informing it, they must listen to the Pope and the bishops. And I've suggested the synthesis, the way forward there, is dialogue. That we've got to move ahead. Well, I think there's a whole lot of other questions where we need to do that too. There's Vatican II, I think, will be a subject of study for years and years and years to come, and we're nowhere near the synthesis. We're still in the period of, the 200 years that preceded it were so powerful that I think they are still holding us backwards. That the mentality that I talked about that led to papal infallibility is still alive and well. And for the very reasons it was alive and well then. As long as the church feels threatened by, the world around it, and it does. Have you noticed how often leaders in the church talk about all the isms? Subjectivism, individualism, relativism, and on and on and on, this great list of, and they're all things we're again and condemn. Well, that's still, to me, too negative. We've got to talk the positives, not of dialogue with the world. And we're not talking that language. We're still standing outside and judging the world. And that's a very old attitude. So this is not, wait 100 years and we might get a proper judgment of what happened at the council. I've indicated here that I do believe the question of the morality of homosexuality needs to be looked at again. But in the meantime, we don't have to wait for that in order to respect gays as human beings and individuals with their rights. You know, I hate that phrase that's been used, including by church leaders. God created Adam and Eve. God didn't create Adam and Steve. And my question is simple. Well, if God didn't, who did? Surely it was God. You know, yeah, I mean, we really have to look at it again. But in the meantime, we have to look at them as people and the difficulty of the life that they've had to lead. I've had to talk, because of jobs I've done, I've had to talk with a number of priests who are homosexual and the impossible difficulties they've faced. And there more than anywhere else, I've gained a great, great sympathy.
How would you explain the doctrine of original sin? Do we still have to believe it? I mean, we no longer believe the myth of Adam and Eve. So could you speak about that for a moment?
The church would say you still have to believe the doctrine of original sin. I've questioned that. As I say, I do not make opposite dogmatic statements. I do question it. However, there is a really serious problem here, and that is the origin of evil in our world. It's always been, for believers, the most difficult thing of all, to explain where it comes from. So that is a profound and difficult theological question that deserves all the attention we can give it. And ultimately, it seems to me that what's been said about original sin is part of that. Now, insofar as it's part of that, I'm all in favour of it. We really need to, you know, it's mystery ultimately, I know that. But we need to, as best we can, try to understand the presence of evil, the origin of evil, not just out there, but right in here. Where does it come from? This you know, Paul's words, I want to do one thing, I end up doing the opposite. And we all relate to that. Where does it come from? This is a really serious theological question. I am not sure, and hence the questions, whether what's said about original sin is a sufficiently good answer to that problem of evil. And certainly not that the story of Adam and Eve is a sufficient answer to that question.
Robinson, towards the end of your book, you made a very interesting suggestion. It's on a slightly lighter vein. You suggested that the bishop's mitre be consigned to the dustbin of history. I entirely agree with you. So does my 85-year-old mother. She found that one of the most interesting parts of the book. But do you think it's likely to ever happen?
I mean, that's a practical one, isn't it? There's no dogmas, fortunately, involved here. There's no reason why the church couldn't. It's perhaps symptomatic, though, that the church would say that it has actually simplified some of those things. You know, which pope was it who did make an appeal to bishops to wear a simple cross, not something studded with jewels and what have you. Would you believe they have seriously modified the robes that cardinals wear? No, you don't. But actually, when you see, I mean, I go back far enough. I was there in Rome in 1958 when Pius XII died. The Sydney Cardinal, Cardinal Gilroy, went over there for the conclave and dressed as cardinals had to dress. And part of it was a train about 10 metres long that you had to carry behind him. That, I mean, now that's been got rid of. So big progress, see? When you see the 120 of them come out, you know, on film at the election of a new pope, you sort of think maybe we haven't quite gone far enough. But, yeah, I mean, so moves in that direction have been made. You know, the most staggering of all was, of course, yes, it was Paul VI
that much, much underrated Pope, a shy man, who nevertheless said, my job is to implement the Second Vatican Council, whether I agree with what they've decided or not. And he did. And do you remember his funeral? It was unforgettable, actually. At St. Peter's Square, and in the middle, at the top of the steps there, a plain wooden box. Nothing, not a single flower. And that was what he wanted for himself. And I still think we've got a lot to learn from that. We go backwards time and again. Look, please, I want to judge a person on more important issues than this, but even John the 22nd did away with various things, and Benedict has gone back to some of them. Well, as I say, I want to judge him on more important issues than that, but I hate to see, even in the small things, the moves backwards. Yes, I'd love to get rid of, getting rid of the mitre. The pastoral staff I'll take, because that's a shepherd staff, and the one I've got's a wooden one, which is so I'm happy with that. But I'd love to do away with, most of the other stuff. Not sure. Yes. Let me say this. I too have been surprised at the reaction that the book has aroused. Overseas as well as here. It's been published in Europe this week, tomorrow or something like that. An Irish publisher is putting it out, but it'll be available for Europe. North America, we're still hoping to break through there. There are two publishers. One's due to give an answer this week. If not, the other one, we'll see. Very hopeful. I'm getting a lot of material, people writing to me from the United States and looking, hoping it'll be published there. I'm going across to the United States just after Easter to what will end up being, I think, talks around the country, which will be interesting because the bishops haven't exactly invited me across. So we'll see what happens there. But equally over there, the right wing is far more organised than it is here. So most of the right wing comments dismissing me and consigning me to various places have actually come from North America rather than from Australia. But there you are. No, but it surprised me just how widespread and how deep is the sorts of things I'm talking about. As some old friends, Lou and Joan, said to me at the break there, when we read the book, we felt these were things we came to years ago, but somehow you've expressed them, and you've given us a basis for them that perhaps we hadn't worked through ourselves in quite the same way. But yes, these are things that we realise the hard way in our own lives, and I think that is. I mean, I think I was answering the question of yours earlier, Alan, saying that I still think this is true. You can't divide the church neatly into progressives and conservatives. You've got this vast body in the middle who are neither. And I got that recently. I was talking with a couple of school principals, and they were talking about the book and said they'd brought it up in the staff room, and they'd got a couple of interests, but from others, oh yes, not interested. And because they belong to this vast group in the middle. And if we want to convert anyone, I think that's where we need to start. You're not going to convert the right-wingers, but with that group in the middle, it's interesting to see. Let me tell you another story. A lady, she'd be in her mid-70s, and she still meets occasionally with a group that she was part of when she was young, a Catholic group, and they still get together. Now, they got together quite recently. They stay overnight down Barrel Way. And they did that, and at breakfast the next morning, one of them said to this lady,
Have you noticed nobody's spoken about the elephant in the room? And she meant this book. It's on their mind. And the reason they agreed was because they felt that two of their number would not approve. And they didn't want to introduce controversy and discord and argument into what was a good group that have helped one another for 50-something years. An important group for their help. And, this had been a really important group to them. And they didn't want to blow it apart. But yes, that's true too. It is subversive, and it does cause division. But it's spoken to a lot of people. I'm delighted in that. I just, where it'll go in the future, is it going to change the church? No, of course not. It requires immensely more than this. But you've got to start somewhere. And we've got to stand up for what we do believe, I think. And say, this is what I believe, this is who I am after 50 years myself of doing things. This is where I've come to. This is what I do believe. And if I find that so many others share it, then hopefully that helps them. But hopefully also it's the beginning of some sort of conversation that can lead somewhere. I know that's vague, but I can't offer you more than that. As I say, let's start with all that big group in the middle and see if they too are open to something. Otherwise, thank you for all the messages of support. They've been wonderful. I've got them from so many people. It's been, overwhelming. Thank you for all of that. It all comes because we all love this weird and wonderful church we belong to. With all its faults, we're the ones who didn't walk away, but stayed the course, and we still want to see it become what it can be. That phrase that I at first had as the title of the book, nothing so ugly, nothing so beautiful. Yes, there's nothing so ugly on this earth as the Catholic Church, but there's also nothing quite so beautiful. And if only we can enhance that beauty and overcome some of that ugliness, then what a wonderful world it would be. One day, let's hope. Thank you.